Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and today we're covering Is Orthodoxy the New Counterculture? And to be perfectly frank, this is an idea that's always kind of bounced around in the background of my mind, but never really organized my thoughts on it. And I think this will be a valuable opportunity for us to reflect where we are as a society, where the church fits into this, where the church could go into in the future, and see this from a perspective that perhaps we have not thought of before. Now, before we get started, I want to start all my shows now by just reminding people to support the show. Links are below. We support the show not because I need money. I don't want any of the money. We want to help raise money for the mission work in Cambodia. I just came back from Cambodia Monday morning. And we could do this by going to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. And also now, brand new, patreon.com/Orthodox Christian Theology for those who want to give regularly without going out of their way to do in PayPal. I will explain later. I prefer PayPal because more of the money makes it to the church in Cambodia. We'll get into details later. I don't want to hold up now on that point. But please become a missionary. Pray about it. Pray for the mission. Consider supporting the work financially. orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, patreon.com/Orthodox Christian Theology. So, Orthodoxy is the counterculture. We are the hippies of the 2020s, believe it or not. And I want people to consider what is the perception of Orthodoxy in 2025 to those converting and reverting, in some cases, particularly in the West, to Orthodoxy in this year. Now, I don't think we need to go very far on the internet to get an idea of what exactly Orthodoxy 2025 seems to be to people, right? It's based and Chadrific, both words I would never use in real life, which is why I only use them in the ironic sense here, but people use these terms unironically. There's something based and Chad about Orthodoxy. It's unavoidably manosphere adjacent. I think anyone who looks at those who are converting to Orthodoxy and does not see some sort of connection to the manosphere is just not being honest. It's actually pretty interesting that, let's say, Father Moses now kind of has the Orthodox version of the manosphere channel. It's very edifying, but that no one else came up with the idea sooner. Right? He tapped into something that's in the culture and he recognized it. And I'm here to say it is a definite part of the culture, a definite part of the counterculture. But then we got to ask ourselves, where's the women? Right? This manosphere adjacent movement doesn't attract women. And I've spoken to mothers in the church. They recognize this. Priests recognize a lot of these are teenagers and 20-somethings that are becoming Christian and Orthodox Christians, but not really the women. And because obviously the manosphere does not apply to women, and I think there's a little more to this, which we'll unpack more later, but the sin that is conveyed by the dominant culture is more attractive to women emotionally, and so it's harder to poach their numbers from Satan, so to say, with this like manosphere adjacent ideology, which is what the counterculture is producing. See, Orthodoxy is being subsumed into this counterculture and is evangelizing to this counterculture, but we're going to find is not exactly identical with the counterculture. And we see this, czar-based bro, exactly everything I just said, totally based in Chadrific. So true, my parish is filled to 99% young convert men. There are only 2 female converts at my parish. And we'll get to also more detail later. This is true overseas. This is true in Cambodia. This is true across the world. There's a bigger thing going on here. There's a counterculture that is at work. We have this comment. There's been a massive crisis of meaning for men in the West, and Orthodoxy is often answering away Islam, pickup artists, and I don't know what MG Toe, but sounds good at the elite. So good point. Now, for those who aren't aware, there are more women involved in Orthodoxy overseas. So in Cambodia, a good number of they're not the majority, but there's a plurality of the choirs and catechumens are female. Now, like you'll go to even large pools of catechumens in American Orthodox parishes, and there might be just one female. And so this is less of an issue outside the West because the gender issues, though they're making massive headway, have made less headway even still than they had done in the West. So women are more involved overseas. And the interesting thing is there's a fellow parishioner of mine that went overseas to that conference in Poland, a youth conference. And I actually said this on Twitter. I'm surprised like not everyone shared it. But if you're a young man looking for a wife, you are a moron if you're not going to European youth conferences for Orthodox youth. Because what you're going to find are tons of English-speaking Orthodox women, which you're not going to find in the West. And because you're American, you're automatically going to get more attention. So it's like, why are guys doing this? I don't know. Thank God it's not my problem because I'm married. And not for nothing, being a married man is a little overrated. Being a monastic is becoming increasingly attractive if you look at what the reality is of our modern marriage. But that's kind of beyond our purview here. But consider monasticism, of course, but also consider finding an Orthodox wife. That's a great way to do it. If you're almost silly and stupid not to. If you can't afford the plane tickets to go there, then you should even think of marriage. You know, you need to obviously have a job to pay for these things. But that's not this video. Now, what else is, to the converts, something that's in Orthodoxy 2025? Well, it's socially reactionary among converts, right? It's a reactionary movement. There's no avoiding this, and we'll get into how this connects to the broader counterculture, the significance of it being reactionary. We have flirt to convert, could be a disaster. That's why you don't want to, that's why you should try to find an Orthodox wife, by the way, right? I've heard people, he's a public figure, say, oh, I'm going to convert a Protestant woman to become Orthodox. And he ended up apostatizing with a Roman Catholic woman. But the point is, he ended up apostatizing. We should be looking for spouses within the church. There's a Truglia canon on this. So good point, Elijah. Now, that being said, it's with these reactionary movements, there's stuff like people want monarchy, which, quite frankly, I don't think is very likely in our lifetime. And I'll get into this, why the broader counterculture, even though it's reactionary, will not be monarchical, but in Orthodoxy, it is. You find people that aren't like the children of the white emigres from Russia that want to restore monarchy or want to restore the Byzantine Empire, and they're not Greek. And it's just part of this sort of escapism from the decadence of the West, which, again, we will unpack. There's also this reactionary move against gender and sexual issues. Very justified, may I add. There are thousands of years of patriarchy that have made pagan and Christian societies very stable. And even so, that's all essentially disappeared since the year 2008. So if you don't think there's going to be a reaction against that, the real surprise is, why hasn't there been a large reaction? I don't think we've seen anything yet. I think what we'll see unfold over gender issues in the next 20 years is going to be profound, let alone the transgender issues, which are also mind-bending. But I think actually we may see get sacrificed on the altar of liberal expedience. But that being said, in the present day, it is an issue. It's an issue for Gen X parents and Gen Z children. It'll be an issue for millennial parents with Gen Alpha children. It's a real issue. Orthodoxy does represent this stand against it. And we'll get into more details exactly how. And then there's the obvious sexual issues with what do you even call it if you want to be heterosexual or homosexual? Your sexual orientation. Obviously, this was something until like modern time, even people that we would now say are homosexual wouldn't actively identify with. It's kind of this outgrowth of Freudian psychology that you would identify with a sexuality. Because think about this. Most people that like steal, they're not like, I'm a thief for a living. I guess like maybe that's a thing because of movies now. Like you have the professional diamond thieves that are glorified in movies and stuff. But people usually used to not identify with their sins. So of course, like we have President Buchanan, we've had public figures that have performed homosexual acts and with homosexual lifestyles, but they didn't identify as homosexuals. That is a sort of anachronism. And so the fact that this has become very hardened, that this is an identity of people, it's an identity of people must be protected, it's an identity of people must be tolerated, now it's an identity of people must be celebrated, this creates a reaction against it because people don't want to celebrate something that they are personally against for moral or whatever other reasons. It's also, as we'll get into, fundamentally oppressive, where you're going to force people to feel a certain way, even if you want them to feel a good way. It's like you have to think this way. That's oppressive. They used to write books about this stuff, like A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. That being said, the Orthodoxy in 2025 is profoundly disconnected from the 90s and 2010s normie undercurrents. It's really a reaction against those normie undercurrents, where the counterculture of that era became the dominant culture of today. All right. And those normie undercurrents have mostly prevailed east and west. And so, like, for example, Orthodox clergy in the east imbibe in intellectualism. They like to be intellectuals. They want to be like the Protestant and Roman Catholic experts in theology and whatnot. But in the West, this is seen as almost bad, right? So, like, there's this disconnect between these converts in the present who are reacting against all these things versus the normie undercurrents, which are still the majority in clergy in the thought process of non-converts. We have a couple comments here before we change the slide. I definitely want to date an Orthodox woman, preferably cradle. Somebody can help me gain the Orthodox mindset as a convert, but I think that's the flirt to convert thing. It's more like you want to be the head of that household. You want to be the spiritual head of that woman. To think that woman's going to actually spiritually help you grow in a way that's part of, I think, is actually wishful thinking and disastrous thinking. Will that woman help you grow? Yes, but the same way Job grew through suffering. So we don't want to think that a woman's going to pick us up from our bootstraps. A man's job is sacrifice for his family. A man's job is to lead his wife. A man's job is to be the spiritual head of his household. And so obviously you're in a different stage of life, the elite, but just be aware that general spiritual principle, saith me, not the Lord. So that being said, let's continue. Converts consciously reject the following. All right. Flaming liberalism. I mean, this isn't obvious. We have very few, not that I don't know a couple, but we have very few flaming liberals that are really on fire for orthodoxy. Because again, flaming liberalism is not part of the counterculture. Now, I'm going to be arguing orthodoxy is bigger than a counterculture. But right now, orthodoxy is having its moment because of the counterculture. Now, one reviewer of my book on Job actually took offense where I used the term flaming liberal in an ironic sense. And so for some reason, it's offensive to the flaming liberals that someone could even use the term flaming liberal, even if they're not even fully against flaming liberals and they're not themselves a red meat conservative. And so this sort of hypersensitivity among flaming liberals creates a reaction against flaming liberalism. And this is both political and cultural and social. Flaming liberalism is very oppressive and totalitarian. Anyone who denies this is just being unrealistic. At least say, yes, we're totalitarian, but we're doing it for your good, and it's moral, and you're racist and sexist and homophobic if you're against our totalitarianism. And I can respect that, though disagree with it. But that being said, this creates a reaction because people generally don't like taking things laying down most of the time. And even though I would argue this is a somewhat culturally subdued reaction, people used to get violent about these things. We're too fat and comfortable to really get that violent anymore. It does create a reaction. And that's why the counterculture should not be a surprise. But there's also flaming liberalism in culture and society, right? And so this would pertain to gender stuff, sexuality stuff, being enforced by the power of the state, being paid for by your tax dollars. This creates conscious rejection because you feel that you have no power over it, right? I can't outvote all these magical votes that appear during the school budget. Those are the most corrupt votes you'll ever see, by the way. Our school budget votes. But like, I can't outvote all the magical votes that appear for the school budget vote or the library vote. I can't undo the fact that, you know, my local library has trans reading hour. And my local library did have trans reading hour until I moved from that town. Every single year. So it's not like something made up. Like it existed in my own town. And so when people feel they can't control these things, they at least begin with consciously rejecting it in their minds, which creates a cultural undercurrent because there's a class of people that are being oppressed. When you oppress a class of people, you're by default going to be creating a counterculture. This is when and I won't go too long aside here, but when the interesting undercurrents in George Orwell's 1984, all right? Because in 1984, if you read the appendix of the book, the presumption is that the Ingsoc ideology eventually collapses upon itself. And because the oppression, even with the scientific approach of Ingsoc of trying to make it where people become totally disfranchised, where they even lose the language to even contemplate rebellion, oppression will create a counterculture. That's always what occurs. And so that's what obviously is happening now. So what else does the converts of today consciously reject? Well, they consciously reject techno-utopianism. Now, even using the term techno-utopianism almost sounds like conspiracy theory, but let's deal with just fact, right? There's certain medical procedures that cannot be named if you want your YouTube channel to stay up, but you were forced to have these medical procedures. These are very new medical procedures. They have unexplored ethical and moral as well as scientific ramifications, biological, by the way. And due to that being the case, people are going to react against that, right? Because this is not a settled idea, an understood idea, and it's forced upon them. Another thing we're seeing is a reaction against AI. There will be comments in this video for the fact that there's an AI-generated thumbnail, because why? There is this idea, and there's some like cool dudes out there like Thaddeus Patrick on Twitter and stuff like that. They're like, all AI is evil. It's like a Ouija board. Just by default, it's like summoning a demon. And so if you use AI, that means by default, that picture must be demonic, right? Because you just summon the demons to create this thing is kind of the idea. So we already see here that to make that step that, let's say, a technology is automatically evil is a conscious rejection of techno-utopianism, because what's the opposite? AI is going to fix everything. It's going to make military superpower, economic production. A society is investing very hard in it. It's going to blow up in their faces. You think we watched enough Terminator movies like where we would not even consider opening this Pandora's box? And, the historians, if we were to survive this moment, will look back at this and be like, man, that was really stupid. So don't get me wrong. I'm not here to, endorse AI and its mass use in society. But I like to view myself as somewhat a moderate on this issue, but being that I'm not some moral authority, I'll just leave it there, and you could call me wrong. Be that as it may. You want to make thumbnails for me and put effort into them and design yourself, I'll very graciously do that instead of use AI through someone else provides them to me using AI. At least I presume so. It looks like AI to me. Now, what else are the converts consciously rejecting? White and or male disempowerment. I used the word white, and I made mention that they're disempowered in some sense. And by the way, we can actually add Asians to this. But that makes you racist and you even say, this is an issue. But the longer we ignore it, the bigger the problem. The more people react against it, the more reactionary counterculture we're going to have. You oppress people, you at least create the ideology to go against the oppression. And then they look for their opportunity, right? They might look cowed. They might look weak. You might think that, because I'm sure the Soviets thought this, Orthodoxy is never coming back, right? Never coming back. They'll be subdued for decades, but they will outlast you because people don't like being oppressed. It's probably hard-coded in the DNA. It's also probably part of the fall, but one of those things that can be kind of used for good. People don't like that sort of thing. And so the longer we take a whole gender that's half the planet and take away their opportunity to compete equally in the intellectual fields, right? Because they're never going to be beaten in the physical fields. That's impossible. not in a general sense. Of course, there's individual exceptions. You're going to create a counterculture, and it's unavoidable. That will be absolutely unavoidable. The other issue is if you take an ethnicity, and that ethnicity, whether it's Asian or it's white, or take historical examples. You take the African people under white apartheid, or let's say Palestinians as Israelis and whatnot. They will react against this. And so the idea that you could deal with a whole group of people unfairly, you could say for good reasons. I'm not even going to debate that here. I'm not here to debate it. But you treat them in an unequal way. You could argue it's equitable, but it's inherently unequal. You're going to create a counterculture reaction. We have to talk about this. One of those reactions, it is resulting in conversions to Orthodoxy, and which is the point of the show, is to talk about how Orthodoxy is the new counterculture, or at least part of this broader counterculture. Now, there's something else that doesn't get talked about a lot, is there's this double shift feminism, which some women, again, not as much as I think we're going to see in 10 years, we're just seeing the beginning of it, are consciously rejecting. Now, that's what the image we see here on screen, and maybe I'll make it bigger. So you can see there is this mother, perhaps, or someone who's not a mother yet, reflecting, what should I do with my life? Should I be a career woman or should I be a mama? Right? And it's interesting because most people look at this if they're not married and go, this is a woman who isn't married yet, considering whether to get married, have kids, or whether to be a career woman. But for example, my wife looked at this and she said, this is really a married woman, perhaps already a mother, and she's kind of considering her priorities. And I think women aren't binary thinkers quite like men are, at least in general. And my wife's like, why not both? Right? Like, we want it all. And if I think a lot of women, again, not the majority, but a lot of women are like, well, why not both? Because that's what society's kind of lied to you about, right? Like, go make children because we need future taxpayers and consumers. But we also need you to be a consumer and economically productive, right? So there's this sort of double shift feminism that they've obviously imposed upon women because of these political and financial considerations. And some women are buckling under the pressure. Now, what's the most popular way this buckles? In my opinion, I'm not a sociologist, but in my opinion, it's the family suffers, right? People look at short-term financial necessity, the car payment, even if, of course, they bought a car that's too expensive or whatever. And like, I can't leave the job, so we got to send the kid to the daycare, right? So which bubble here wins? You can say, oh, I'm doing both. I'm a mama and I'm working, but you sacrificed the mama on the scale and you just increased the working woman. And I think the scriptures, they talk about this about money, but I think there's a broader application to this, which is we can serve two masters. We can serve both God and mammon. Now, men are kind of weirder double taskers. I don't think it's very moral, but like women, I feel, are better when they focus on one thing in general. Again, I feel, I'm not this expert on this. And so generally speaking, a man can just focus on his career. And unless he's not, and as long as he's not like abusive and like autistically focused in his career, he can still be a stand-up father, right? Like he's there to do discipline. He could still offer advice. He's going to be less hands-on for everything, but he can even still show up for the baseball games and stuff. And no one say he's a bad father. At least historically speaking, that would have been a great father for almost all of history. But the mother who sends her child to daycare, I mean, yes, that's the majority of mothers now, but we wouldn't say that's 100% grade A mother material, right? And so there is a double standard. I'm not here to even justify it, but women are buckling under the pressure because that double standard imposes more on them, more than they can handle. So it's going to create two kinds of women, generally speaking. The women are just going to, totally disown cultural conservatism because that demands of them to be mothers and they want careers. They want to see the world. It's the sort of stuff, if you watched old television like The Twilight Zone, those are sort of women where bad things happen to them. I mean, generally speaking, that's the whole horror genre up until the 90s. It's like this kind of subtle thing in horror genre was like, essentially independent women acting like men create this force in the universe where like evil killers come after them, and in the Twilight Zone, weird parallel universe stuff and all that. And so society, even when showing it, even in some risque movies and stuff, especially in the 90s, always kind of consciously rejected it. And we don't have that now. And that being said, it's you do this, but you're really not going to be a mama or a hands-on mama or the grade A mama. And so a lot of women are saying, well, then I do want to be a homemaker, at least primarily so, right? There's women that have part-time jobs or certain hours after work. And with remote work, it's amazing how much you could do with a full-time job and really be putting your full-time attention elsewhere. But even that is expecting a lot from an average person, right? The average man, generally speaking, again, not everyone, doesn't work full-time remotely, but really is doing mostly childcare, right? Men don't deal with that. But yet it is expected of a lot of women. And so this is something that a lot of women buckle under, and they want to, and a lot of women are going to consciously reject and are starting to consciously reject. I will add this. I am not a trad wife type. Maybe I aspire to be, but here's why I'm not, because in the real world, I do see trad wives and homeschool mothers and stuff. They're not schooling their kids. They're not cooking dinner for the guys. They're not cleaning the house. You start wondering, what are they doing? And this is a lot of them, especially among millennial women. This is a lot of them. In fact, the majority that I know personally outside of Jordanville, and that's kind of scary. Jordanville's a very special situation. But literally the majority that I know, and I travel like the world, and obviously go to church and have a wide circle of friends. This is something that is very concerning. So this sort of, if you're not married, and the manosphere stuff, I'm just gonna get myself a trad wife. Don't think that trad wife's gonna necessarily do more for you at home and with the kids than the woman that's working. This is a bigger issue. I will cover this in a different show on Christian homeschooling, at least in some detail. But I just want to say this because I'm not here necessarily even endorse it. I'm just here to pick out, why are their converts consciously rejecting the dominant culture? And what are they rejecting? Well, they're rejecting double-ship feminism because the pressures it poses. That doesn't mean because they acknowledge real pressures, their response is always justifiable and consistent. That's not my argument. Now, before we change slides, we got a few comments here. We have this one. AI is simply a tool, one that could be used for good and evil, but will probably be used for a lot of evil, sadly. Now, saith me not the Lord. My opinion is things get their power from the intent of the user. I think this is very obvious. A knife could cut food, and a knife could stab someone to death. Really, it's the intent of the user that makes it good or a weapon. A gun could defend someone. It could be used to murder someone without provocation. It is a tool. A computer could help do the taxes for a church or a charity that helps tons of people. And a computer could be used to do the taxes for a horrible corporation that pollutes and kills people, right? It's the intent is what gives power. I think it even applies to things like medicine. I think a lot of us have broken bones and stuff, have taken some level of narcotic in the hospital when they're setting the bone or something, and we don't become junkies because I think the intent using it isn't to abuse it. Yet the person who has, for whatever psychological issue, I'm not here to condemn that person, takes a narcotic to subdue emotional pain, that person then becomes an addict. And so the pharmaceutical, which historically speaking is a kind of sorcery, right, could be both good and evil. It could be a medicine, and it could be essentially a kind of witchcraft. It all depends on the intent of the user and sometimes the intent of the provider of this thing. And so I, for now, cautiously see AI within that spectrum. I've seen it do too much good things with translations where, I just don't see how could there be anything evil about this translation. The Lord tells us to judge with righteous judgment. And I do think we have, like I said, with the intent of the user creating great spiritual power behind all sorts of objects and things, where I think AI could very well fall into that. But I would add, though, when you have this thing that makes lousy art, that makes lousy entertainment, and it takes tons of energy and destroys the environment, you have to sort of wonder, like, why are they pushing this so hard? Same with crypto. No offense, crypto guys. Cash out your crypto, donate to the Church of Cambodia. I love that. But the point is, it's like you have this thing that we didn't need to invent that wastes tons of energy, more than printing real money. And it's pushed by the people that want to save the environment. And you're like, this is totally contradictory and it makes no sense. You have to kind of wonder, what's the spirit behind this thing? I don't think it's of God, if I had a guess. But again, I'm just some dude with a YouTube channel that's blessed to evangelize and write on these topics. I'm not like this moral expert. So that being said, I will leave that there. Now, that being said, Alexis says, I decided for Orthodoxy because of its apostolic succession and theology, not as a way of counterculture, perhaps, but we'll kind of get into that. Like, I chose Orthodoxy because of the issue of schism being sin. But we're going to explore. There were seeds of counterculture in my own decision, though I was unaware of it. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. We have AI will never become self-aware. I think people watch too many movies, but it doesn't need to be self-aware not to do dangerous things, of course. Someone says, glad the Orthodox self-aware and grounded history asks these questions. Oh, you haven't seen nothing yet. Let's continue. So we have, what is counterculture? Now, people may notice if they follow Orthodox Christian theology at all, is that people tend not to make response videos against me. And I think a big reason why is they have to unpack too much to even begin proving a point to discredit me. So they just try to discredit me as a person. So that being said, a big part of my method is to create the foundation and prove that it's true, not just call someone a name and say, you must presume upon this foundation. I don't see how anyone takes it seriously. It's pretty unintelligent and uncouth, but be that as it may. I'm going to be setting a lot of foundation here, but not the boring sort of foundation. So let's begin. So that being said, let's define counterculture. Counterculture is a deliberate rejection of dominant culture. All right? In the picture there, we see in this, really the turn of the 60s, it's 1970, Gay Liberation Day. Well, clearly that was a conscious rejection and a deliberate rejection of the dominant culture, which was not pro-homosexuality during that period. So clearly that what we see there, not only by their clothing, but by their ideology, is a countercultural movement. Now, it's worth pointing out, why does counterculture react? Because dominant culture controls institutions. This is the whole part of the I'm not sure if dialectic would be the right use, but there's a dichotomy between the dominant culture and the counterculture. Because the dominant culture controls government, schools, economy, churches, media. And I'm going to just put it very straight. If your goal in life is to make Orthodoxy take over the world, well, you better start working on taking over the government, taking over schools, taking over economy, taking over churches, taking over media. Because if you look at the Byzantine Empire and the Russian Empire, well, these are Orthodox empires because they did actually control all those things. That's what dominant cultures do. So to think that, ultimately speaking, that we're going to have the same sort of historical mass success without doing that is ahistorical. Okay? Now, a big part of counterculture is that dominant culture is seen as both lame and oppressive. Let me repeat that. Lame, right? It's lame. It's just stupid, right? It's just boring, dorky, and oppressive. And so a big thing is when even the hot new thing, let's say certain gender ideologies become the dominant culture, they don't view themselves as dominant culture because they think they're pushing an envelope. But pushing the envelope is actually not what makes you counterculture. Right? Your dominant culture wants you to control all the levers of power. And so by controlling all the levers of power, they're making themselves look lame and oppressive. And the weird part is it's actually going to remove the sort of attractiveness, even sinful attractiveness from these things. In fact, as I will argue, that's why there's so many male converts. Because if you look at what's attractive, even let's say sexually, which is obviously lust is a sin, it don't look that good. It's very easy to reject. It's kind of viscerally gross. And so it makes it very easy for a whole audience of people to start opting out. So that being said, we'll do a few audience comments. We'll move to the next slide. We have conversion is always more intricate than because of theological reason X? Yes, there's a lot of emotional reasons. I wonder if this is Maximus or Amelia there, though. We are about 50-50 male and female in our academy class. That's very rare, even internationally. And I'm also in the South, where both men and women are more traditional. Don't know, maybe if they're married couples, by default, they're taking their wife or girlfriend. So, but interesting situation, Sal. And for a Southerner, it looks like you're Italian. It's also interesting. Well, there are a few women in my catechism class, but most of them are sporadic and often how they show up. I've also noticed that in Cambodia, they tend to be more sporadic because, again, they have less of a motivation because they don't have a whole countercultural impulse behind a decision. They have more of the pre-countercultural impulse, which we'll cover a little bit. I guess Seraphim makes music and games and opt out the program into the program. This is interesting, right? To leave the matrix and plug into another matrix. We'll talk about that a little bit. Good point, GK. So counterculture in recent history. Again, we're doing background, but it's not going to be boring background. Obviously, the Roaring '20s, those are flappers on screen. If I don't know, I hope Zoomers still know this stuff. This was like obvious stuff when I was growing up. But in the Roaring '20s, what did the counterculture do? They rejected the warfare state. Just consider what happened in World War I and how oppressive it was, the anti-free speech laws, the economic controls. Obviously, they're going to reject that. They rejected the economic controls of World War I in one degree or the other. In the United States, it was reactionary. In Europe, it was the opposite, went far left wing. They were also rejecting pre-industrial social norms of previous decade, right? Because obviously this existential threat to humanity was like a Job moment for the whole world, and they start thinking, "Oh, I'm suffering. How could God be real?" I mean, obviously, that's one of the worst logical arguments ever. But people rarely make logical decisions; they operate on emotions, and so this led to a rejection of religion. This is why Anglicanism went from Anglo-Catholicism the previous decade into full-blown liberalism. This is why the Greek Church went from based in Chad, as they say, to becoming full-blown ecumenist. Of course, there are the makings of this before that. Of course, but what was the impulse was World War I, and that changed stuff, just like World War II changed a lot of things. All right? And so how did this manifest itself in the counterculture? Well, the pushing of women voting to this becoming dominant internationally. All right? So we're not just America, obviously. Military reduction, right? This is a conscious rejection of the warfare state. Unorthodox music like jazz, the idea that you wouldn't have people deliberately writing music that's beautiful but just playing the horn randomly was actually really outrageous for its day. This is why, for example, overseas madmen like Hitler and stuff like that were very much against jazz. But even people like George Orwell was very much against jazz. They viewed jazz as this kind of base, uncultured, stupid thing. But again, it was a rejection against something that wasn't based on uncultured classical music. So religious liberalism, like I already touched on, but also left-wing revolutions. And this gets ignored a lot because people look at the Soviet Union and go, yeah, that's left-wing. Obviously, that's left-wing in the 20s. They look at America and they don't see a strong left-wing, right? Because it was a right-wing takeover. But most of Europe had these sort of left-wing takeover to fascism is a kind of socialism. National socialism, you would hope people would know this, it is a kind of socialism. It's just a socialism that's race-based, right? And so these sort of ideologies take over because it's a rejection of what was occurring before then. And then they totally take over by the 30s, which we're going to get into in a second, right? Counterculture mostly subverted dominant culture by the 30s. By the 30s, yes, there were some old dudes that didn't like jazz, but jazz pretty much took over. It kind of evolved into big bands, which was like a little more organized into the 40s. But right, like he kind of got jazz light to be accepted, and jazz was never totally rejected, right? Counterculture became the dominant culture. Military reduction continued into the 30s, right? We ignore this, but right, like Great Britain signed a military naval agreement with Nazi Germany to reduce what they thought was the size of German fleet. 35% versus 100% of the British fleet actually been a great increase in the German fleet, but that wasn't the intent of the deal. And that was in the late 30s. So we see this idea actually pushed into the 30s because the counterculture became the dominant culture. This would be a little more obvious if there wasn't a Great Depression, because the Great Depression makes it where you're busy about working, eating and stuff like that. Not necessarily like, waxing poetically about these cultural movements. But generally speaking, the counterculture mostly subverted dominant culture by the 30s. But then, of course, there's World War II. The 1940s was a time of repression and conformity due to existential threat. There's no doubting this. It's pretty much put all the cultural change and put it on hold. It took the growing left-wing ideology that took over in the 30s in the United States and kind of put it on a stasis, right? We're not going full commie, right? We're staying with not even full-blown market socialism. This is kind of American version of left-wing ideology, the Roosevelt New Deal ideology. And so we see this worldwide, right? Even when Germany loses World War II, the state after National Socialism was still market socialist, right? It's not like they changed that much, but World War II creates a stasis. And then after this, right, the counterculture, once there's no existential threat, picks up again. And so the counterculture is always against what's imposed, right? The stasis is imposed. We need measured pro-market socialistic measures during World War II. So they say, I'm not endorsing it, but that's what they think. So, right, that's what's imposed. So of course, you get the reaction against the imposition, which was Robert Taft on the right wing, but more dominantly, right, the beatniks and stuff on the left, right? Anti-war, right? Existential threat made the anti-war counterculture of the 20s become pro-war. And so, of course, then back to anti-war with the counterculture. The peace sign stands for total nuclear disarmament, for example. So this is a big thing of the anti-war part of the 50s counterculture, not the 60s. They were also opposing market socialism because they wanted full-blown socialism. Because market socialism, accept it or not, that's essentially the whole world's market socialist. We're not capitalists. We're market socialists. And so, of course, what is the rejection of this full-blown left-wing ideology or a full-blown reactionary like what Goldwater was, which, right, in 1964 in the United States. So you have these reactions, but generally speaking, the left-wing was the larger part of the counterculture because think about it. There at least was still some sort of market in market socialism. So the full-blown rejection of it is the more countercultural impulse, okay? Gender and social issues did exist in the 50s, even before birth control. Gender equality, open sexuality, free love, as it later would become called in the 60s, all started in the 1950s. And even when it was talked about, there were some subtle, even rejections of it, like I was talked for in the Twilight Zone episode, horror genre and things like that. Even in the media and the part of society that accepted these things, always kind of accepted implicitly the dark side of it. And because, again, that part of the dominant culture didn't fully die. When counterculture takes over and subsumes the dominant culture and becomes the new dominant culture, it always compromises in respects. It's never pure. I'm going to repeat that. When the counterculture takes over and becomes the dominant culture, it always compromises and is never as pure as what preceded it when it was in its full countercultural state. Generally speaking, what gets compromised is its anti-war stance, and that's all I remember right now, but we'll get to more of that a little later. Now, the counterculture in the 50s also categorically rejected religion. Now, this took a very different path in the United States and Western Europe. In Western Europe, it kind of led early on to this kind of atheism, which is why, like, right, in the Church of Norway and stuff, like in these state churches in Scandinavia, they actually have atheist bishops. Like, their job is bishop of a Lutheran church, and they identify as an atheist. This is very European. At least our flaming liberal clergy pretend to believe in God. You know, they'll say all sorts of weird stuff, but they pretend to believe in some sort of God. In the USA, there was this other sort of reaction. In the 50s, there was this huge return to church. And this is what people understand. They look at the 50s and think, wow, everyone went to church and was conservative religiously for all of history until the 1960s. But this isn't true. They weren't that religious in the 20s and 30s. This was a peculiarly American response to World War II, was to have the Leave It to Beaver lifestyle. And part of that was going to church, having 2.5 kids and all that stuff, right? And so America's response was to go to the churches, but start opting out of what those churches taught. And this is why, where does this meet in the middle? Is stuff like Vatican II, the full-blown liberalism in Protestantism and all the mainline churches where they became fundamentally unchristian. It would be unfair to say this is where something like St. Vladimir Seminary and Orthodoxy was at in the 60s, but ultimately they did move towards this because they're about a generation behind these impulses. And it appears in recent years, St. Vladimir's is starting to reverse that, by the way. And again, this could be due to the counterculture. So that being said, this took different shapes in Europe and the USA. We have this. This was not a conversation I expected to see. It's just an idea that took shape when I wanted to give an update on the Cambodian mission. So we will do that later. We have this. Adorno of the Frankfurt School also hated jazz. So there you go. There was a lot of people who rejected jazz. And this kind of, when I talked about AI, jazz had a lot of power when it was new, and it was a conscious, intended rejection of dominant culture. Now jazz is old-fashioned. It lacks that spiritual impulse because it lacks that intent. Very interesting case study there. So then we move into the 60s. We got to talk about the 60s, the counterculture, right? I don't think so. 60s are overrated. 60s are the consummation, 60s and early 70s, by the way, are the consummation of the counterculture in the 50s. And then they very quickly became the dominant culture, essentially. So it's like, there's really nothing new about 60s counterculture, other than like how the clothes looked. I remember studying the 60s in college years ago, and all the old beatniks ended up becoming hippies. It's kind of like when Guns N' Roses started, they were a hair metal band in the 80s, and they started wearing flannel in the 90s. They became a fake grunge band of some sort. But in reality, they're just a hair metal band wearing different clothes. And that's all the beatniks were when they became hippies, or just beatniks wearing hippie clothes. And that's pretty much it. So all that happened in the 60s was the mass popularization and consummation of what occurred in the 50s. But the 70s and 80s is a more interesting thing to talk about when studying counterculture. In the 70s and 80s, they essentially conceded the counterculture. Now, people might not think this, but just try watching some of these really terribly boring movies from particularly the 70s, right? There's stuff in these movies that until maybe the last 5 years, and it's saying a lot, it's like, wow, this is really like hedonistic and really inappropriate and unfriendly to families. Stuff like glorifying single mothers to a degree you wouldn't even see in the 2000s, which you think the 2000s is much closer today than the 70s. But in the 70s, the entertainment was very base. You would have PG movies with full-blown sex and nudity. I'm not kidding. There's a movie in Mystery Science Theater. I didn't actually watch the real movie. You just see it in Mystery Science Theater. And it's called A Touch of Evil. No, A Touch of Satan, I think it's called. Of course, terrible movie. That's why Mystery Science Theater is making fun of it. And it was a PG movie that would be shown on TV with full-blown sex. Right? This is something that only flew in the 70s. The 70s was actually very base. One person called it a literal diesel punk dystopia. And if you look at just how dangerous the cities in the 70s, the drug problems in the 70s, if the economy wasn't so good and people just didn't quit their jobs, they just kept working as alcoholics and cokeheads, society would have collapsed. But there was enough cultural inertia of showing up and actually doing something for a living that we muddled on after the 70s. But in the 70s into the 90s, and you young bucks don't remember, but people randomly bombing people in the mail occurred. I mean, that's insane. No one thinks about that anymore. The last time we had a mass killer in the mail was the anthrax guy from the year 2001, and that's 24 years ago, when he was mailing people anthrax more than 20 years ago. But if you look at we had the Unabomber in the 90s, we had the Puerto Rican people that were blowing things up because they wanted Puerto Rico to be free. Now they want to be a state, which is like, wow, that really reversed itself. We had the Weather Underground. We had literal terrorist groups blowing stuff up. Planes actually blew up all the time. We had less security. It was just a more dangerous world, and people were like kind of fine with it. It's kind of hard for people to imagine, because like back then, people getting bar fights sometimes get really hurt, and like they weren't suing anyone. It's like, I should have not lost that fight. It was just a tougher society. I could see why we wouldn't want to go back to this stuff, but were the 70s a diesel punk dystopia? Pretty much yes. That being said, this diesel punk utopia also had this dominant counterculture at this point, right? At this point, the counterculture was the dominant culture, and this leads to a kind of countercultural response to it, which was the Reagan 80s. And this had Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, so there were equivalents to this overseas. And what we saw was this conscious distillation of the really crazy stuff out of the counterculture, right? Like I said, when the counterculture becomes the dominant culture, what this results in is compromises. It's never as pure as the counterculture. We've gone this far, you're going to wonder, what on earth does this have to do with orthodoxy? It has everything to do with recent conversions after 2020. So, but again, we got to lay the foundation if you really want to understand it. So that being said, the really weird gender and sexuality tenets of the counterculture of the 60s were pretty much, and 50s, were sold down the river. Okay. And so I put down, for example, the Equal Rights Amendment, which in some respects is the least controversial amendment you can imagine. Men and women are fully equal. But why was this considered crazy? Because normal, even empowered women don't want to be fully equal. A good example of this is a 90s show called The Nanny, where the 15-year-old or teenage daughter asked Fran Drescher, who's the nanny, you believe women should be totally equal, right? And Fran's like, yeah, but men should still open the doors and pay for the meals. And it's a ha-ha joke. But it actually points at something more profound. People don't want full equality. One of the by the way, countercultural shows the era is All in the Family. Excellent TV show. They would never make a TV show like that anymore. And it just shows you how pathetic society was, because the point of the show was to validate the counterculture and to empower the disempowered. But even then, there were limits. There's an episode where Meathead's wife wants to be a fully liberated, equal woman, and Meathead, even though he's a flaming liberal, can't get down with it. And this is an interesting thing, because in the counterculture of the 60s, I won't get into the details because it's quite lurid and inappropriate, but even among the supposed enlightened counterculture of the period, men weren't willing to give up the upper hand in relationships, right? That was just, patriarchy was just too entrenched for too long. And so even women really didn't want men to give up being like the man in the relationship. This had certain ramifications even upon sexuality in the era, which I don't want to get into. But that being said, in All in the Family, Meathead finally was arguing with his wife, and then Meathead finally says, all right, to her, we are equals in this room, which is their bedroom, right? So he wasn't willing for her to be an equal out there in the world. And this wasn't good enough to her. And you know how the episode ends in this counterculture show? With their hands in each other's back pockets, she capitulated to Meathead. So the moral of the story of this episode of All in the Family is women can't be totally equal. And so the ERA culturally was dead on arrival, even though, like, in the realm of ideas, it's not insane. The idea of men being fully equal to women is not insane. In fact, probably men would kill for that now, if you look at that. But that being said, it was insane in the 70s, not so insane today. The sexuality tenets with homosexuality, with what became AIDS, with even, I just want to go with people that are minors and stuff like this. This was just too crazy. You couldn't get, you had to get a kind of counterculture light to be the dominant culture. But the pendulum swang too much the other way, and this created its own culture against the dominant, now counterculture, which was the media became more conservative, other than like this new burgeoning counterculture like Howard Stern. A great movie to understand this, though not great in any other respect, would be like Howard Stern's Private Parts, because Howard Stern's whole career was pushing the envelope, the FCC, and corporate culture. If And it's not like, Imus and a lot of these other characters weren't subversive figures in their own right, but they were subversive within counterculture light, which was the dominant culture in the 70s and 80s. Stern became this new counterculture, which we're going to see big in the 90s, anti-man, anti-corporate. You can't stop me, push the envelope till it absolutely breaks. And that's what he represented. And so did rock music. That's why, let's say, you look at the pop stars, the men dressed as women, like they weren't supposed to be gay. That wasn't the idea. It was just to be really, what do they call this in movies these days, where the movies are just not respectful, irreverent. I can't pronounce words. Irreverent, right? It was to be deliberately irreverent as a way of rejecting the dominant culture, even though the dominant culture was really the 60s counterculture. So it's a pushing of the 60s counterculture to go more extreme. All right. And that's what we have in the 90s. And before we unpack the 90s of 2008, which perhaps is the last counterculture because it became the dominant culture today and might never go away. This is where orthodoxy comes in. Before we get into the 90s, let's get into some of your comments. We have, let's see. You're going to touch on how a lot of counterculture was pushed and guided by people in power. No, I'm not going to get into that actually, because I have a more simple worldview here, which is, it's like a law of physics. My opinion, saith me, not the Lord, is that the universe has a single origin in God. And so all things that come from God, both ethics, morals, and physical laws, are consistent with one another because their source is the same. So just like there's inertia and there's things like for every action there's equal and opposite reaction, I think morals and societies follow analogs to the physical laws. All right. Now, that's my opinion. You could totally reject it, and I'm not trying to oppose this opinion on anyone. But my thesis here, which could be tested and proved or disproved, is that a counterculture is the inevitable result of a dominant culture imposing itself. Now, that doesn't mean that counterculture will always inevitably win. It's just that a counterculture will exist. And that counterculture doesn't become a dominant culture until it takes over the levers of power: government, corporations, religion, education, etc. So we have that. So it's nothing against Jay Dyer. It's just I'm working more simply. I don't consider myself a political commentator. So we have this. Are we going to mention the liturgical pandering Vatican II that failed to get kids back in the church? Only briefly. We already covered that when we discussed the 60s. It was part of the 50s counterculture. We have this. The 70s was full-blown unhinged Jew. All right. I have to be careful reading this comment. Not that I'm offended. I am half Jewish, but I just don't want this video taken down. So that's your opinion, and you have said your opinion. We have, do you think countercultures are organic or planned? They could be, but that's not the impetus behind them. The impetus behind them is moral, like I said. It's like this moral physical law. Very action is the equal and opposite reaction. That's why a good dominant culture will still create a counterculture, because I just think that is the moral force at work at all times. Again, can't prove it, but that's the thesis. So that being said, oh yeah, I already changed the slide. We'll get to that in a second. So as I said, the 90s starts when maybe the last counterculture, which means that's the last dominant culture, because now we're going to be having new counterculture after that. And what was this last dominant culture that existed? This existed when I was growing up. So to be honest, for me, it's weird it don't exist anymore. There's some hanger-ons. But in the 90s, professional jobs, right? Like, so what people saw as the normal job, the normie job, still had suits, still had ties. Women did not wear pants. I actually remember commercials in the late 2000s where they were supposed to be edgy because they showed an old white guy saying, women shouldn't wear pants to the office. And, the hip, cool, black professional woman's wearing pants. And, oh, that really showed it to that white dude. So that's like in the late 2000s, and they were still pampering this idea that women wearing pants was this like big controversy. But in the 90s, it was very controversial, right? Women wore skirts. This is how recent this stuff was, at least to me, because it's in my lifetime. They were groomed. They would shave. Men were expected to shave. They keep their hair short. You're expecting to have weird piercings and tattoos showing and stuff like that. Even sports teams like the Yankees, up until like 2010, essentially, you weren't allowed to show your tattoos. You had to shave, no beards, no mustaches, unless like you were a super good pitcher and they couldn't help but allow like a little trimmed mustache. It was very serious. It was very serious. This was part of professional culture. This was the last dominant culture in the traditional sense of the term. Sexuality was in the privacy of one's home. And so you didn't get into the weird stuff. People were actually very tolerant of the, let's say, the untraditional stuff, but it was all private and they didn't expect it to be public. This is why even up to 2008, the far left-wingers like Barack Obama were running against gay marriage because no one would accept it. It was just considered, hey, it's okay if, not that there's nothing wrong with it, as they said in Seinfeld, but it should be private. Because that was, again, the last echoes of a dominant traditional society. Religion was seen as normie and catering to families, right? So like the typical thing back then was you grow up in church, then, you know, once you're a teenager, you go out, you have fun, you do all sorts of, you imagine what the fun, evil things are. You settle down, you still get married, have kids after, even though you had all sorts of partners who still expect you to marry, you know, you settle down because your parents settled down, your parents' parents settled down, your parents' parents settled down. So, of course, you're going to settle down, right? Even though you did all these untraditional things, and now you go, all right, well, I guess I'm going to do what my parents did. My kids go to church. No, none of us believe in this stuff. And so it was very normy. Going to church wasn't a rejection of the counterculture, of the dominant culture. Going to church was just full-blown normie stuff. Also, and this has to be discussed, and we're going to see this, in my opinion, is the real impetus. There's no real conspiracy. It's how technology affects media and money, is that the media is corporately controlled, and the media's got the FCC to deal with, only so many avenues in which it can make money, and so you can't offend too many customers because you don't make money, right? So the media is corporately controlled, and this means the media can only push counterculture so far. Yeah, it has to be within an acceptable degree so that like they don't get boycotted, lose advertisers, the FCC close them down, things like that. And then, you know, again, other countries have things analogous to the FCC in the United States. FCC obviously controlled what was on radio and television. So what happened? What happened was broadband internet and eventually smartphones. Why do I have a little thing that says Fahrenheit 451? Well, Ray Bradbury, when writing the book, made the observation, what leads people to burn books? And he really wasn't a countercultural figure in some respects, which is interesting because most authors of dystopian books are seen as subversive. But his observation was, he was writing this, like I think in the 50s or 60s, I think 50s, was that you write something about this, it offends the Italians. Write something about that, offends the Catholics. You say something about this, offends the Jews. You say something about that, offends the Democrats. You say something about this, it offends the Republicans. You say something about this, it offends the Irish. You say something about this, it offends the Russians. You say something about this, it offends the capitalists. And so it gets to the point where you got to remove so many things from books, you might as well burn the books. And so the point of Fahrenheit 451 was a sort of obvious literary extreme to discuss what identity politics was doing to media. And so it's a genius book when you understand the point of Fahrenheit 451. So it's essentially the dangers of identity politics destroying free thought. Now, what happens when identity politics doesn't actually destroy the company, right? Because the company, right, doesn't want to offend the Roman Catholics. They're 5% of their customers or 25% of their customers. And they don't offend the Italians. They're 9% of their customers. And on we go. Well, then what happens is you get a Fahrenheit 451 situation where they delete everything. Because, all right, it's got to be this milquetoast normie stuff because that way it doesn't offend anyone. Well, the internet deletes the naked profit motive from the norminess, right? Because available content that's consumed now no longer is attached to very limited amount of outlets, right? So now you could have a website about this crazy thing. If you're offended by it, don't go to that website. You could have a video about that crazy thing. If you're offended by it, don't watch it. And now you don't even need to endorse it with an advertisement, right? Because you put your advertisement next to it. It shows that you endorse this. Believe it or not, the pop-up ad was invented because they wanted a way that the advertiser could say, we're not endorsing the content on this website, right? Because it's not on the same page. It's a pop-up ad. It's totally separate from that website. That really is the reason why the pop-up ad was invented. But Gen 2 of this was selling data and information, right? They don't make money anymore by some stupid billboard or advertisement. That's not the main way of making money. The main way of making money is selling your data. And then they could cater advertisements to you because they know what you're watching, won't offend you because you're picking what you're watching, cater to you. So now you've created this impetus where you no longer have this corporate media that's going to kind of normie and be dominant. It's going to go full-blown counterculture in 1,000 directions because it can make money doing it now when before it couldn't. And that's all it is. And why could it make money doing it? Because the technology changed. And that's what this graph shows. Now, when people look back, they actually have this kind of ahistorical view of events. People kind of think 1998, 1999, that's when everyone got a computer and everything changed because that's the dot-com boom. But that's not reality. Not reality for anyone outside of New York City, LA, and Silicon Valley. Most of the country wasn't really on computers yet. The threshold of change really was until 2008, which coincidentally, not so coincidentally, it coincidentally aligns with Barack Obama's election. Right? So it's kind of this happy historical accident. But it really was a technological impulse that you really don't get usable internet where you can really do a lot because 56K or 52K, I can't remember what it was called anymore. But dial-up internet really stopped working. Right? It's just the websites were too advanced. But if you look, it was by far the majority until the mid-2000s. But the internet moved way past dial-up internet, but it wasn't the majority. Dial-up you don't get more than 50% of the country with internet worth a darn until 2008. And that's what leads to this change where you've got this uncontrollable impulse of countercultures and the death of the last dominant counterculture, or the last dominant culture. And that's how the counterculture, because the change of technology, has become the dominant culture. All right? So the question now becomes is, what was the counterculture that's today's dominant culture? And I think that's Papa Roach. I can't remember anymore, but I'll tell you what it is. Angry white boy music. Even though they're not all white. It's just like that's the stereotype. A bunch of angry, self-hating white boys. And so that being said, what was this 90s to 2008 counterculture? It was anti-corporate, anti-man, anti-war, right? Guns N' Roses made the song Civil War. Like, really? Like, we're talking about, like, Vietnam, like it's yesterday and it's terrible. Alice in Chains made the song called Rooster, which is an anti-Vietnam song. They're still making anti-war movies in the 90s. Even Steven Spielberg in 1997 Saving Private Ryan, and they're showing the American flag in the beginning. It's actually a call out to what's that 30s Nazi movie, something about the people, the big popular one that the Nazis used as a propaganda movie. I think Triumph of the Will. Steven Spielberg is showing an analog of America winning D-Day to be an equivalent of Triumph of the Will of the Nazis, because war is evil, right? That was the normie countercultural impulse, which is like, wow, Steven Spielberg also made Schindler's List, and he's Jewish, and he's really against the Holocaust. But he was still a countercultural figure, and war was part of the counterculture back then. And that's implicit in Saving Private Ryan, a 97 movie, which has aged phenomenally. They've not made movies like that almost 30 years later, which, like, what's wrong with Hollywood? But what can I tell you? So that being said, this was the counterculture. And I remember growing up during this. Drugs were cool, not because, like, oh, man, my parents are mean to me and I cope, or mind expansion. They were cool because they had such lame ways of telling you not to do them. because they told you not to do them, then that means you should do them. And the best joke that they had that kind of encapsulated this Gen X and I'd say early millennial mindset that was in the 90s is in this show called That's My Bush by the creators of South Park. And the joke was that George Bush's wife made a banner because she wanted to have this big issue against drug use. And the issue says, don't be a quitter, do drugs. And the joke was that it was supposed to be don't do drugs. But the second layer to the joke was, how lame is this, right? By saying, don't be a quitter, do drugs. Even if you said don't do drugs, you're essentially telling them the same thing because it's lame, right? Like the dare lion. You think that lion was going to make kids not do drugs? Super lame. It was super lame. And so the counterculture in the 90s was, if it's lame, you reject it. And so that's why guys wear flannel, because flannel was a rejection of ties and stuff. That's why that picture of Nirvana in the previous slide, right, is they're monkeys in suits, right? The idea is, look at these monkeys in suits. This was making fun of the dominant culture. And how do you make fun of it? By wearing flannel, right? That was the idea. And this eventually became those outrageous tattoos and everything, right? Because normal people don't have all these outrageous tattoos and full-blown body modification, all the horrible spiritual directions it has gone. Again, this really does connect to Orthodoxy, but you've got to understand this if you want to see why we are where we are. So that being said, it was anti-corporate, right? This is why Pearl Jam wouldn't use Ticketmaster. They called it Ticket Monster, and there was no band bigger in the 90s than Pearl Jam. Now, people might not remember that because they're still alive. They didn't go out in a blaze of glory like Kurt Cobain killing himself, which is not all that glorious. It shows our sin. But they were bigger than Nirvana. They were way bigger than Nirvana. They were anti-corporate. Or take Guns N' Roses, who were huge. He went on, Axl Rose just like disappeared for 20 years until he made like Chinese Democracy because like, I'm not going to make the man money. I'm just going to live off my residuals. Right? Like that was just a very 90s countercultural thing. And these musicians were true countercultural figures. In a weird way, right, when that counterculture ends in 2008, Guns N' Roses starts touring again. Whew. Like, how did that happen? So that being said, it's very much anti-corporate, anti-man, and anti-war, as we covered. It's nihilistic and atheistic, right? It's the final stage in the rejection of religion. It's not just liberally rejecting religion, like mainline Protestantism, like normie Western Orthodoxy eventually started doing, normie Orthodoxy in the West, like Vatican II Roman Catholicism. Where do you go with this? Where do you go now? Where do you go is to nihilism and atheism, because there's no farther you could go. And that's the last stage, essentially, in this counterculture. And so they go full-blown nihilism and atheism. The quote Papa Roach, cut my life into pieces. This is my last resort. Suffocation, no breathing, don't give a blank. I mean, you just go as horrible as possible. You're at the bottom of the toilet at this point. And that's because that's all they had to go to, was full-blown nihilism and atheism. And this is obviously where we get into these sort of unashamed, I'll skip a bullet point, unashamed hedonism, right? With sexual issues, gender issues, drugs, because of full-blown nihilism. All that exists is feeling good right at the moment. Nothing else matters. Of course, it's going to leave people empty. That's why people are becoming Orthodox. That's where we're going with this. But, right, this full-blown embrace of nihilism and atheism, which is this final stage of counterculture that's become our dominant culture today, is why Orthodoxy is having its moment now. I'll repeat. The full-blown nihilism and atheism that was part of the counterculture of the 90s of 2008, which is now the dominant culture, is why Orthodoxy is having its moment today. All right? Now, a big part of this, which is somewhat bizarre, and I don't know why, I'll leave it to others to speculate, is it was very self-hating, but only for some ethnicities. So, like, if you listen to rap music, there's nothing self-hating about it. They would even, Bone Thugs and Harmony would even glorify the fact on welfare. There's the song First of the Month. The whole East-West rivalry in 90s rap, and they're killing each other, was glorified. It's like Tupac was a martyr. He's a saint. He's still a saint in the hood. And the reason that's the case is because they weren't self-hating. The band Kiss, Gene Simmons actually reflected. It's like this new, like said, no one, rock music is losing its moment because people don't want to hear about being sad. They want to hear about like being with girls and being cool and touring the world. You know, again, that's 80s schlock. But of course, that's where Kiss came from the 70s and 80s. But this counterculture was responding against this, perhaps because it's somewhat like anti-corporate, that like you take the man, who's, I guess, the white man, and you bring him down. And so if you are the white man, you bring yourself down, I guess. Like kind of this self-hatred. I guess, you know, now Jews and Roman Catholics aren't alone in their self-hatred. It's become dominant in society. So that being said, self-hating for some of these genders, but affirming for others, right? Affirming for others. Obviously affirmed the women to the point of superiority. That's why by 2008, you know, New York didn't have no-fault divorce until like 2010, right? Because the idea was you had to have a reason to get divorced. And that was last vestiges of a dominant culture that didn't empower women more than men, right? Like the Equal Rights Amendment era was just even bring them equal, but that was too far. Now women has gone beyond the men, and this is why we have the reaction against this. That's the final stage of counterculture here. That's now the dominant culture. It was pushed by MTV, but MTV quickly got sidelined, and it was pushed by social media, and there was no stopping it. Because, again, whatever weird group could have its own website, could have its own MySpace page, its own Facebook, ultimately its own YouTube even. All MySpace, which doesn't exist, Facebook, Twitter maybe on the tail end, YouTube, all existed. All the stuff that exists today by 2008, right? There's a reason why 2008 is when this counterculture died and became the dominant culture. Because by 2008, all the technological seeds, the apps and technology and software and websites that were needed for this culture to be unstoppable, because no FCC or our market force could stop it. In fact, the market forces now support it. Were in place by 2008. It is not a coincidence. They were in place worldwide. All right. So let's do some audience comments, and then we'll get into more into how this counterculture became the dominant culture. We have, do you think countercultures are organic? Oh, we covered that one. I blame the seed of Amalek. All right. That's your opinion. I will not endorse it, simply so this show doesn't get taken down. I think any element of planning is riding the wave of cultural trends. And that's, like I said, because where does cultural trends come from? Conscious rejections of dominant culture. All right. And where does that come from? I theorize the central moral like force or law of nature almost. And of course, the Obama phone. Why do you think they were pushing Obama phones? Because they get the counterculture to be the dominant culture. So we have 90s culture becomes dominant culture, and like previous countercultures, it sheds its anti-war and anti-corporate aspects. How coincidental is that, right? Obama and the Democrats, who kind of represented the counterculture of the last dominant culture of George Bush and the pro-war and the, cultural conservatism against gay marriage, all that stuff. That's how Bush won the 2004 election, was by going hard against gay marriage. They totally are against those things in the 2000s because they're the counterculture. But once they become the dominant culture, they're all of a sudden very pro-war, more pro-war than Trump has proved to be, very pro-war, and they're no longer anti-corporate. Oh, we want universal health care. Well, how do we do that? Well, we give people tax penalties and penalize them unless they give a company their money. I kid you not. That's what Obamacare was. Unless you gave an insurance company your money, you were penalized. That was universal health care. I'd much rather have all that money we spend on Medicare to actually just give us single-payer health care. That would make a lot more sense, and actually would be cheaper per capita than what is paid in Europe and Canada. But no, let's not do that. Let's just force people. Let's spend all the money on Medicare anyway, right, and rip off the American people. And then on top of that, penalize them on their taxes if they don't buy health insurance. How pro-corporate could you get? And that has permanently marred the former countercultural figures like Dennis Kucinich's memory. Because Dennis Kucinich sold out on this. He went on an airplane with Obama. Obama sold out on this. Early Obama would have never done this. It's just a total sellout. It's when the hippies became corporate sellouts. right? They took over the levers of power. They became the dominant culture. They became the man, and now all of a sudden they're not anti-war and anti-corporate, but they're still in favor of everything else that was countercultural, right? They're still left-wing. They're still nihilistic, all these things that were part of 90s counterculture, because that's all the dominant culture is today, is the 90s counterculture. That's it. It's not something different. Now, digital media sells data, as I already said, so counterculture is profitable, and that makes it unstoppable. And this graph here shows almost everyone has a smartphone now. About only maybe 10% of the population doesn't by the present year. And as a result, it's just everyone's got internet. I actually know someone who didn't have broadband internet to 2020, but he had a smartphone. I know someone who in 2017 didn't have a smartphone, right? So it's like they're people that until fairly late had no access to the internet. But that's like today, that's almost nobody. Even the Amish, the reason the Amish actually went in the election and voted for Donald Trump is because they all have smartphones now. So the technology has changed society, but now, right, the technology made the counterculture the dominant culture, but it's laid the seeds for what I think may be the final counterculture. And this is where Orthodoxy comes from Ron Paul. There, I said it. Orthodoxy comes from Ron Paul. You're going to, at least the converts, not the religion, it comes from Jesus Christ, 33 AD. But this whole modern Orthodox moment comes from Ron Paul. He'll be in the history books if they write honest history books, because it does. And that's why you scratch the surface of like any of these like Orthodox figures that are popular. If they were like alive and at least like 12 years old when Ron Paul was there, they were a poly. And it's not a coincidence, because he is the beginning of this counterculture. Now, obviously, Ron Paul was an old guy. Even 2008, he was an old guy. And so it's not like his ideas, his countercultural ideas were new. They're just a rehash, as I already said, of the Taft ideas of the 50s that weren't as popular as the beatnik countercultural ideas. But now, finally, they have no competition in the countercultural thing because the dominant culture was the former left-wing counterculture. And so the seeds of the last counterculture are unavoidably reactionary. They're Goldwater-esque, they're Taftian-esque, and Ron Paul was the champion, and everyone laughed at him for it. You couldn't get more counterculture than Ron Paul, all right? He was socially, he was canceled and everything, but he was socially conservative, which was different than previous counterculture. He was a married guy. He was against abortion. He was against personal drug use, though he didn't think it should be illegal because he was socially libertarian politically, just not a personally social libertarian. And so you start having this countercultural figure that's having a moment that is now accessible to people because the internet. Before that, I knew who Ron Paul was because he was a guest on the Alex Jones show, right? He was a local Texas politician who called into the local Texas show, and that's how you would know Ron Paul existed. He wasn't a national figure. He became a national figure because of social media, because of YouTube, because of MySpace and Facebook, because of message boards, which are pretty much dying out now. That's what gave Ron Paul his access to having countercultural cachet. Now, another part of it's not only socially conservative, it's very distrustful of post-World War II institutions, normie conservative and normie liberal. And this is what makes it so contrary to what we have today, because what we have today is still a post-World War II society, post-World War II institutions. But this counterculture that was essentially popularized by Ron Paul, and he was the standard bearer of its earlier torch bearers, such as, again, Robert Taft and Goldwater, was himself distrustful of these World War II institutions, and so now he mainlines that in the new reactionary counterculture. And so this will have effects on if people understand Orthodoxy, because they're coming from this before they become Orthodox. They're coming from this reactionary counterculture. Now, an interesting thing about Ron Paul himself, because like I said before, the countercultures end up becoming compromised over time, was it was thoughtful and not bigoted. Now, that doesn't mean Ron Paul himself was not, he was definitely thoughtful. It doesn't mean he wasn't a bigot. He had those racist newsletters that were probably written by Lou Rockwell that really exaggerated the already very bad things about Martin Luther King in very colorful and unkind language, which I won't repeat. And so even despite himself probably being a bigot, for what it's worth. His movement was not bigoted. And this is kind of an old school thing, but like even bigots would do kind things for people they were bigoted against back then. So like Ron Paul was a doctor. And so even though I speculate he's a bigot, I don't know in the end of the day, being that he was against Civil Rights Act and all that stuff, kind of gets into that. But that being said, it didn't stop him from giving free medical care to Black people and stuff like that. So it's like it wasn't like he was immoral, right? So the point is, the movement itself wasn't bigoted. And the movement itself would say, oh, Ron Paul didn't write those newsletters. Look at this person that Ron Paul helped when he was a doctor who's Black and things like that. Because it was consciously rejecting bigotry. And so this reactionary counterculture was more moral and religious, really. All right. It was actually kind of moral and religious. And that's why it drew a lot of conservative Christians. Now, Ron Paul's runs in 2008 and 2012, the Tea Party, they were canceled and denigrated, right? They would take him off TV. He would be second place in, let's say, Iowa real polls, not just like online polls, but they wouldn't even show him. It was like the Soviet Union. You would see first place and third place and fourth and fifth and sixth. You wouldn't see second place when it was Ron Paul. It was a flagrant hatchet job against Ron Paul. And again, that just feeds the counterculture. Yes, he won't take over, but the more you persecute people and oppress people, you create this moral force for the counterculture. That the dominant culture gets arrogant and creates its own counterculture. And that's what was happening with Ron Paul. And this is what we're going to see has created Orthodoxy's moment in the last 5 years. All right. And the same happened to his son, Rand Paul, who was canceled. And people might forget, because 9 years ago is a long time for some of my viewers, and not for me, obviously, because I'm old. I'm 40 years old. That Trump was the false alternative. Trump was posed as literally this crazy madman who had a speech in, I think it was Arizona, where he went down an escalator with a paid audience. He had a fake audience back then. Remember, he was a reality TV show, and all reality TV is fake. My mother goes from reality TV. All reality TV is fake. And he had a paid audience, and he gives the most outrageous speech you could actually kind of imagine. They're sending us, they're worse, they're sending us rapists. Like, I have a sense of humor, so yeah, I could laugh at it, but it is insane by normal standards, obviously. You don't call everyone that comes from a country, even illegally, a bunch of rapists. It's just kind of crazy. But the media actually kind of treated it normal because they thought he would be a glass jaw. You get him to win the Republican primary, he says all these outrageous things, and then you destroy him, but the problem is it didn't work. He won by mistake, which is why they then crucified him for the next 4 years. All right, so really the last traditional counterculture figure in the Paulite mode was Rand Paul. He still exists, obviously. They tried replacing him with Trump. It didn't work, and then Trump has kind of subverted this counterculture. All right. It maintains a lot of its respects. You could go to ronpaulforums.com. They're all Trumpsters, though they don't agree with everything Trump does, because in the end, there was a countercultural impulse that Ron Paul was spearheading. It wasn't they were pro-Ron Paul. They were rejecting the dominant culture, and Ron Paul gave them a voice. Trump has now given them a bigger voice, even if he's not as ideologically pure. To quote Donald Trump, I am your voice. Leave it to Trump to put it very simply. So he even says he is the voice against the dominant culture. He's embracing the counterculture. So we got some comments here. We have the, let's see. Catholicism led to the Protestant Reformation. The boom of Protestantism led to atheism. Orthodoxy is the only cure. The church as the hospital leads many back to Christ today. Amen. We have the iPhone came out in 2007. It sure did, but it was nowhere close to mainstream. It was too much. It was way too expensive. And as we already showed in a graph, smartphones were by far the minority. It took into the mid-2000s where they're the dominant. But right by the mid-2000s, by 2014, you had more than half of smartphones. You had way more. You had almost 80, 90% with broadband internet. And right now that becomes unavoidable. So that's more my point. Unavoidable that no longer TV stations and select few corporations and interests could Fahrenheit 451 some sort of entertainment. Now it's selling data this way you make the money, and you could have any sort of thing without worrying about which group you offended particularly. Again, until we get into the 2020s. We'll be there in a second. What needs to happen for another change to occur? We will cover this. Depends on the change. In order to avoid a worsening and to save the world, people need to repent more, obviously. I'm a bit of a bigot myself, to be honest. Doesn't mean you can't be nice to people, right? I'm friends with bigots. And there's bigots that are jerks. And there's people that aren't bigots, but they are vindictive jerks. So, I don't know. You could not like that I'm Jewish, but as long as you treat me nice, I really don't care how you feel about Jews. So that's a whole other thing. Evidence the audience was paid. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a known fact the audience was paid. You could look it up. This show is not about that. But yes, it was definitely a paid audience. The escalator speech, if you want to look it up. So the counterculture in recent history, we have with the death of religion and nihilism as part of dominant culture after 2008, soft persecution begins over things like bathrooms. I won't get to too many more details, but when you start saying you can't use your bathroom without people that are dangerous to you going in there because you might hurt their feelings and stuff like this, it starts to become like a soft persecution. To quote my brother, the people that were in favor of this were the people whose bathrooms are being invaded. So it's kind of hard to feel sad about it, but it was kind of like a moment where they could realize how far and how hard they could push the persecution. So it didn't seem like a big deal back then because, hey, it's your problem if you want these other people using your bathroom. But it's become now the persecution's gone hot. And that's why it became an issue. But that's where it really starts, is soft persecutions. Before this, we already had these sort of soft persecutions and things like college admissions. Like, again, affirmative action is a form of this. Divorce law against men is a form of this. So it existed, but now it's like starting to go full blown and pervasive, right? It doesn't just affect the individual. It affects all bathrooms, right? It doesn't just affect the individual applying for college. It affects all social media, right? You could literally be taken down and stuff because it affects everything. So this is something that starts changing. Now it really changes. And we got Paul here, I presume from Cambodia. Shout out to Paul. Why aren't you sleeping? I don't know. They're 12. Well, maybe it's not as crazy. There's 12 hours. All right. Well, God bless you. We'll talk about Paul a little bit, actually. That's a little later. That's after the 2020 elections, the soft persecutions become legitimate hard persecutions, right? You lose your job unless you cow, right? You go to jail unless you cow. If that's not a persecution, I don't know what is. I guess no one was shot back the head. I guess that's real nice. And this was over parental rights, over medical procedures. I'll leave that vague because I don't want the video taken down, but just connect the dots. If you don't go down with, which is why I even speak this vaguely, if you try to defend the rights of parents over their children's biology, you could have this video deleted. You could lose your job and things like this. So you have to be very vague about this stuff. Personal medical rights after 2020. I'll also be very vague about this so this video doesn't get taken down. Because again, there's a hard persecution, and I know people that lost their jobs over it. So it's not your imagination. It's real. There was a hard persecution, and there's clergy to this day that can't be normalized because of this persecution. So there's no doubt it's a persecution. Voting rights is another thing. You lose your right to vote when people that aren't real could vote in your place. That's just reality because it happens in my wife's country. That's been normalized in the West. It's been normalized to the point where it's not even your imagination. They cancel elections in Romania. The president of Georgia, who lost the election, refuses to step down. Finally occurred, thankfully, and hopefully the same happens in Romania. Even if I don't know them well enough to even know I agree with them, I just think that's a matter of let the voters have they say, or just don't have a democracy, have a monarchy. But that being said, voting rights have gone full persecution. It's like in Ukraine, there's no elections. At least Russia has fake elections. In Ukraine, there's no elections. And even the funny thing, like in Russia, even people say even the elections are totally legitimate. Putin will still win them, right? So it's like it's hard to get as mad at someone would still win versus like where they're literally not having an election. They're literally canceling the election. They're literally not leaving after they lost an election. That's hard persecution. I mean, they took the Romanian guy and they put him in jail. If this is not a persecution, yeah, they didn't shoot him in the back of the head, but what is? All right, what could be? Certain people who protest an election result went to jail. If that's not a persecution, I don't know what is. Even certain ethnicities were physically attacked, right? Physically attacked, and the police don't protect them. Again, this is what the Nazis did with the brown shirts. This is, obviously the Reds had their own version of this, the communists and all that, the Maoists and all this. These are hard persecutions, right? And so this leads to a countercultural response that is much stronger than it was during the Ron Paul era. And this leads to people really responding because Trump in his first term and the churches did nothing. They just totally cowed. Trump and the churches did nothing. And so the people look for what is the strongest response, because the counterculture is always ideologically extreme. So what is the strongest response? All right. And that's where we enter into Orthodoxy in recent history. We finally made it there. So let's do some audience questions when we get there. Unless you're a leftist, we're all bigots by today's standards. And the interesting thing is leftists could literally hate and physically harm certain races, but because they're right-wing, the people they're hurting, it's okay. Again, extremely immoral, can't justify it. Ron Paul took $20 million and walked away after he didn't get the Republican nomination, refused to run as an independent. I think that $20 million became part of that student, like Young Conservatives of America or Young Libertarians of America or some nonsense. And it fizzled out. The Ron Paul movement and Ron Paul himself just wasn't very good at organizing itself. He was, again, more of an intellectual spearhead. I don't think he just pocketed it, though they did hire family members, but that's like in every organization. I mean, so as long as that person is doing their job, I guess, hey, at least I know this person, they're doing their job, that's fine. Like when I had my business, my wife worked for me. Wasn't a good idea, but it did happen. The only way that soft persecution can happen is after the feminization of men. Yes, that's part of it. We have, I guess, some celebrations going on there. Great presentation. Thank you. And we will continue. We are not done yet. We are not done. So the pre-COVID Orthodox boom was more Ron Paulish in flavor because I'm actually from it, right? Like they were socially conservative politically. They were more economically libertarian. There was less like extreme angst among it. The post-pandemic Orthodox boom is far bigger and it's Trumpish in flavor, right? It's dropping its libertarian streak and it's more racialized, right? So they're not overly concerned with equal voting access and stuff like that. They want monarchy, big part of this is like they're against miscegenation and stuff like this. Out of full disclosure, obviously, my wife's a different race. Though to be fair, my parents were different races. So it's sort of like, do people care if the children of miscegenation themselves miscegenate? I don't know. I'm sorry if it offends you. Something I intend to offend you. I didn't mean to be born, but it is what it is. God help all of us. So that being said, it's definitely more racialized. It's lost its libertarian streak. It's a more compromised version of the original reactionary counterculture that Ron Paul was the spearhead behind in 2008. Which again is kind of its own historical accident to begin with, right? He didn't have to run for president that year, but the fact that he was kind of a nobody and everyone rallied around him, I think really shows it was its moment. It was the moment for the previous counterculture to become the dominant culture, which by default was the moment for the new counterculture to begin. So I don't think that part's coincidental in 2008. Now, it's inconsistent with the Orthodox witness during the pandemic. So it's interesting. You have this huge impetus for orthodoxy, right? Because it's this conscious rejection, we'll get into how, of the dominant culture of today. But really, orthodoxy was kind of lame during the pandemic, if you're just being honest. The people that really weren't lame, that were ultra popular, my bishop at the time wasn't, by the way. But he wasn't like the head of the church, but Patriarch Ilya of Georgia and Patriarch Neophyt of Bulgaria, I sort of think both men might end up canonized because of this, if I were to guess, but I don't know the future. But they were the only high-profile Orthodox figures that were utterly uncompromising on this question. And I do think God will remember them for it. And this is something where you watching this need to appreciate these men, Patriarch Ilya is still alive, because they were utterly uncompromising in sacrificing worship during the pandemic. And the pandemic killed people. We had to take important medical measures to stop it. People have their right, as my bishop today teaches, to decide what medical measures those were. So I'm not here to talk against any of that, but we should never sacrifice worship, ever, ever, ever. We should never sacrifice worship. That's really been my agenda for the last 5 years whenever I talk about the topic. I was talking about this before the pandemic was mainstream, by the way. So like I had my own Alex Jones 9/11 moment where like what made him big was that he predicted 9/11. Well, no one gives me credit because apparently no one gives me credit for anything. We'll get into that a little bit later. But before the pandemic got big, I would say no matter what, do not sacrifice going to church. And to be fair, it wasn't my own idea. I was just reading articles. They were quoting guys like Patriarch Daniel of Romania and stuff like that. He ended up buckling. But Patriarch Neophyt, who was the patriarch of the church I was attending at the time, and Patriarch Ilya of Georgia, they did not buckle. God will remember them for it, in my opinion. I don't know the rest of their lives, but I think God will remember that. Now, Orthodoxy in Europe, because Orthodoxy now is this kind of idea that feeds into this countercultural impulse. Orthodoxy in Europe is seen as this reaction against European integration, right? Romania is no longer just Romania. It's part of the EU. So there's this conscious integration into Europe where you start getting persecuted, you lose your independence. So this creates a counterculture. As I already said, it's just unavoidable. So Orthodoxy is this already culturally available means, because it's distinctly Romanian in Romania, distinctly Serbian in Serbia, etc., that you could tap into. So they tap into Orthodoxy, even if their personal lives may not all be that religious. All right, it's this conscious reaction against European integration, against immigration from people outside of Europe, right? Because it's not a European thing. These people aren't Romanians. These people aren't Serbian. These people aren't Polish, etc. So by kind of clinging to the church, you're consciously rejecting the other who's looking, that is being sent there to persecute you, because that's really the idea. They're taking your job. They're taking over the levers of power. You don't have the right to talk about it. You're being oppressed. If people were just coming in, but they weren't made more than equal, you wouldn't get this reaction, right? So the gendered sexuality issues that are imposed, and this is part of a loss of national identity and culture due to the imposition of Western monoculture, right? The Western monoculture is being forced because they are shutting down websites, because now only a few people control all the servers in the world. So they could shut down websites. They could ban you from social media. And so this creates a conscious rejection against it, right? And so this conscious rejection in Europe pushes up Orthodoxy, and self-identification as Orthodox. Similarly, in the USA, Orthodoxy is a reaction against watered-down spirituality, because watered-down spirituality is what sold out during the pandemic. Watered-down spirituality is what has devolved into nihilism and atheism. And so people want the exact opposite, because counterculture is always as extreme as possible. And that exact opposite is Orthodoxy. It's a reaction against political instability, believe it or not, because Americans... Name how many countries on earth have had the same constitution for 250 years. It might be less than 5. And in fact, it might just be 1. It might be just USA. I'd have to look it up. But France has had multiple republics. Germany has had multiple republics. Maybe Britain, right? They've had common law and everything for centuries. But that being said, you have stable systems where all of a sudden have become very unstable. Stable systems which had a decent track record of not having, like communist-like persecutions, now having communist-like persecutions. And so that freaks people out. This is not the America I grew up in. I need to cling to something that doesn't change. Orthodoxy doesn't change. Lutheranism changed. Anglicanism changed. You know, the liberal, yes, so they got the rock. You know, the Anglo-Catholic Church got the rock guitar mass at 9 o'clock, and then they got the traditional organ mass at 10:30. That kind of has less appeal than Orthodoxy, right? Because they don't have any of that, pretty much. There's no electric guitars. So it attracts people because they are looking for stability in a politically unstable world, in a morally unstable world. It's a response of persecution, because if you can't be safe because of your ideology, you can't be safe because of your race, then at least you have some sort of spiritual escape. You could go to heaven. And a weird thing is, George Orwell in 1984 actually talks about this, because in 1984, the protagonist is like, you know, if I could keep my rebellion even in my mind, as long as Big Brother doesn't break me, then I've won. And so there's this impulse that even the dominant culture is oppressing me, at least if I am free in my own mind, I've won. Right? It's not like George Orwell, who was an atheist, invented this idea. And so for that reason, we have Orthodoxy being this appeal, because it's a spiritual escape where there's oppression, but I could be free somewhere. Right? And Orthodoxy is a richer spirituality. So it's like going into a better way of escaping than, again, all the stuff that really doesn't let you escape in the same way spiritually, right? They don't believe in theosis and stuff like that. And we have this, Britain doesn't have a constitution because Parliament cannot be bound by past parliaments. Any constitution has to be passed by an act of Parliament, but it has the Magna Carta and common law, and those are unyielding and unchanging. I guess it's analogous, but all right, it's another notch for America. All right, another notch for America. So we continue. The Orthodox veneer. Now, I don't want people, part of this is a cautionary tale. I am very pleased that people become Orthodox, because the dominant culture is so evil, they look for the correct spiritual escape, which is Orthodoxy. But the problem is they could become disheartened if they see things not as ideologically pure as they want. If you look in church history, the church was never ideologically pure. It wasn't ideologically pure when the apostles were alive. The apostles were arguing with each other and arguing against other people in their lifetime and warning against heresies. So there is never ideological purity. The church is a continuing consensus. That's what's pure. Of the saints, not in every respect, all men alive are pure. We're sinful men. That's not what exists. So when people are looking for this spiritual escape that's perfect because the world's so defective, it may appear to a veneer to them, or a facade, and this may lead to rejection. Because if I've already seen countercultural figures, again, the disfranchised white dude, use the stereotype, apostatize, because ultimately speaking, Orthodoxy didn't fit all the notches on the belt they thought they were going to have, and the other one is they get a girlfriend, and that girl is not countercultural, and so she does some things which we won't talk about. And so yes, that makes people apostatize too. It always has, which is why Israel was warned in the Old Testament not to miscegenate with the unbelievers, because it leads to apostasy, which we talked about before, right? Orthodox should marry Orthodox. By all means, seek out the youth conferences overseas and things like that. You'll find as good a wife you're going to find, in my opinion. And there's now, since past the pandemic, they're starting to youth conferences here. Go to those conferences, find yourself a spouse if you want to get married. But seriously, consider monasticism. That being said, what is the veneer that Orthodoxy offers that motivates conversion to Orthodoxy? It's stable and unchanging in a chaotic world. The doctrine doesn't change, which again, if you understand our magisterium correctly, is true. Out of all kindness to Eric Ybarra, he does not, or pretends not to, understand our magisterium. If he wants to have a show where we talk about our magisterium honestly, then fine. But then he would have to honestly talk about that magisterium henceforth after this. Now, that being said, unchanging in morals. But, right, it's not always across the board, right? There's people with these doctrinal aberrations like communion Roman Catholics in the Greek church of married spouses, right? That's obviously an error. You could argue there's a liturgical error, but I think that goes into doctrine. If you look at Archbishop Epi de la Foros's justification for it, moral, similarly speaking, but that doesn't mean in every respect. We even have whole jurisdictions have gone wrong in certain moral issues. But again, if you understand the magisterium, that's not paradigm destroying for us. It's, again, those who pretend it is are either very, very ignorant or they are just dishonest. But that being said, when people become aware, oh, wait, there's contraception's an issue, and that might be a real issue here, or there's a female deacon, and was it Zimbabwe or whatever, that this creates, or even the gender issues, that the normal normie parish is very affirming of stuff that is really non-traditional with gender relations. In fact, even the conservative people, I feel, are very dangerous and wrong on the gender issue, and it has ruined and will continue to ruin real Orthodox marriages. And I really want someone to pick up the torch on this because I'm not the right man. But that being said, this is a real issue. And when people become aware of it, they could become disheartened. Liturgical stuff, they go, it's unchanging. But yeah, the Greeks have organs. And men and women used to be on separate sides of church. They're not any longer in most churches in the West. And in the East, that's starting to disintegrate. The head covering thing is starting to disintegrate and stuff like this. So you start seeing changes, and so it looks less unchanging. So that facade or veneer looks like it's merely a facade or veneer. Again, not if you understand our magisterium, but again, to the normal schlock that is simply in the counterculture and is looking for an outlet in the counterculture. At first, Orthodoxy looks good, and then it starts looking not as good, and that leads to apostasy. We have to have an honest conversation about this. Now, ethos in Orthodoxy, right, appears very conservative, but then he's talked to bishops, and they imbibe in the very liberal stuff because they have PhDs and stuff, and they imbibe with the normie intellectualism. I don't think they will in 20 and 30 years, but they do right now. And so the ethos is as conservative as people think. So long story short, Orthodoxy appears stable and unchanging in a chaotic world. As we see in that picture, we literally had billboards up that told people to rat to the secret police on their neighbors. Right? Like 1984 stuff, communist stuff, was in America. And so people see this, and this obviously leads to a reaction. This is why they go, there's something wrong with the world today. I don't know what it is. Right? And then they start looking, and that looks like to be orthodoxy. So someone somewhere does the right thing. So orthodoxy, because again, we have a consensus-based ecclesiology and epistemology, is protected because our consistency is preserved over time, not in everyone in every respect at a given moment. And so I do know churches which are gender separated. I do know churches where there's head covering and they don't do the liturgical innovations and they have the correct doctrine. So they exist. Somewhere does it right, and it's radically different. There's no gender separation in the Roman Catholic Church, head covering in the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have these things. So orthodoxy still comes far ahead, right? They're still far in the lead. But when people start scrutinizing the particulars, because they're looking for something idyllic as a perfect response to this very hedonistic and nihilistic dominant culture, they become disheartened and apostatize. Now, another response is the aesthetics are conscious, the purposeful adoption, right? Because it's foreign to the converts. So they adopt these Orthodox aesthetics, the long beards, the black, the art, the iconography and stuff like that. It's a conscious rejection of the West and its decadence. It's realism, which exalts the man and leads to nihilism and atheism. It's clothing, which extols personal beauty instead of humility. People just pick up on it's more worldly, and the world is nihilistic and atheist. I don't want that. I want the Orthodox thing. Now, of course, Satan subverts it. Like when guys become very effeminate and they care how their beard looks and stuff. Yeah, you know what? I won't use the word because I don't want this video taken down, but I could use the word effeminate, and very strange to me. Because, right, you're just now making worldly what is not from this world. So that being said, the aesthetics are part of this too. They always were, which is why the pre-pandemic convert was more of the artsy-fartsy type. We have a whole show on why people convert to Orthodoxy. So people can refer to that if they want more to this. This is just to bring to light the countercultural sensibilities that are the impulse behind it. All right, so we got another slide, but let's do some audience comments before we get to that. I used to love jazz, but then, right, it became against his racial ideology. He has the only woman in my parish is single woman, is an autistic woman in the military. The rest are teenage minors. I don't think Orthodox parents already talk about teenage arranged marriages. I do think historically, I won't get into the age stuff, but historically, arranged marriage is probably better because it's death to self, right? It's more about the commitment. You're going to be married, and unless you rent to a monastery, now you got to make it work, and you got to carry your cross. And generally speaking, people that aren't you could make better, passionate decisions about who you'll get along with than yourself going by your own lust. It's just reality. I'm not planning to get married. Well, may God willing you become a monk, but consult your own spiritual father. It's just that from what I've seen historically, that's like either marriage or monastery. This idea of being just single without being obedient to anyone is potentially spiritual dangerous, but that's why you worked out your spiritual father, so you're obedient to him. Just don't have this romantic view of spiritual fathers. Most priests don't want to get involved in your life. They're normal human beings. But you could go to monasteries and stuff and try to seriously discern this, even if the people there are perfect. So that being said, let's go. We are on the next slide, that Orthodox veneer. Now, what else does Orthodoxy provide to both the reverts and the converts? It provides a path transcending the nihilistic world, right? Theosis provides something that gives your life meaning. Prayer life provides your life meaning. Grace provides your life meaning, while the nihilism in the world leaves you feeling empty and gross. And, by the way, just looks repulsive, particularly for a man, because men are very visual. It just looks repulsive. And so, as I said, what the world offers is unsatisfying and, quite frankly, gross, and the least people leave empty. But another thing Orthodoxy provides is like it's the bottom of the rabbit hole, right? You're from the West, or even if you're in the East, because it's now this Western monoculture that's being imposed upon you. It's this exact rejection of the Western monoculture. It's about the death of the self, not the extolation of the greatness of man, which comes from guys like Pico della Mirandola and things like that. It's a bottom of the rabbit hole without becoming some weird niche cult, right? That's kind of important. It's not like this niche weird cult. And so that way you could go to the bottom of the rabbit hole, but pretty much still be normal and not too crazy. And, right, it's, you don't have to, that way you can become Orthodox, but your family won't disown you. So that makes Orthodoxy way more accessible, right? So you're a hippie, right? You go to the Byrds concert, you went to Woodstock, but you didn't move to, the kibbutz or whatever weird nonsense they had back then, right? So you could go to the bottom hole without being too weird. Now, in the West, this bottom hole thing is everything's a lie, right? So if everything's a lie, we got to find what's not the lie. Moon landing, that's why like a lot of people come in Orthodox. The moon landing's a lie. The world being round's a lie. Outer space is a lie. Everything's a lie. And so that's the mentality behind finding Orthodoxy. Something's got to be true when everything's a lie. In the East, it's more, I think, Western monoculture is a lie. So it's more this like nationalistic response to it is the countercultural impulse. But that doesn't mean just like the 60s had its own cults, we are having our own cults form as well. And because of the technology, as we discussed, we have this mass broadband internet and smartphone internet. This leads to cultish online groupings through apps and whatnot. And I'm going to take a brief aside here on this point. Is I've been a real victim because I don't form a cult of personality around myself because I'm from the 90s. I'm against the man, I guess like in my circuitry, right? Like man's bad, right? Corporate's bad. People that want to, lead people like televangelists and take their money, they're bad because I'm against man, right? that comes from, again, the counterculture I grew up in. That was the society and the stuff that was being pushed, and the music and stuff I grew up listening to. So that being said, believe it or not, I'm somewhat of a public figure. You could say Craig Truglia's a nobody, but the reality is Craig Truglia is someone that has an Episcopal blessing to do this evangelism. I promise not to show this every show, and I don't like credentialism, but I'm bringing this up to make a point about the cult mentality, which we really got to repent from and work hard against. So, like, for example, when I was at Cambodia, and this is beautiful, the Metropolitan of Singapore awarded me this medal for all of our work, which we'll get into, all of our work. I'm just a means growing the Church of Cambodia and making them vibrant and on the upswing. And so, right, if I'm this nobody, how am I getting awarded bishops by not like little podunk true Orthodox? It's the Moscow Patriarchate. It's a very mainline, the world's largest Orthodox church. And it's, again, not because I'm the best person ever, not because I'm the most brilliant, not because you should listen to me. That's not the point of this. I'm not saying, look at these credentials, listen to me. The point is, I'm someone that has an opinion that needs to be taken seriously, and I'm someone who is taken seriously from real people in the church. I actually get published in books, right? This is Rise and Fall in the Papacy. This book is actually in Holy Trinity Monastery in the bookstore and sold in their website. It's sold by an actual Orthodox press. And so that being said, it's like he can't be a no one if his books are actually published and the bookstore sells a book with a bishop's blessing. I gave a lecture at a diocesan conference to priests with Vladika Peter, blessed memory, right next to me. Now, that doesn't mean Vladika Peter or any of the priests there endorsed all or any of the content that I said. But I gave a lecture, and it was blessed by the bishop, and it was listened to by about 36 priests. And because of that, it's not because I'm great. The point is because I'm actually someone that fulfills some sort of function within this church that has to do with evangelism. And that's my only broad blessing. I had my Episcopal blessing to teach at the diocesan conference, of course. And of course, my being there was blessed by the bishop there. So there'd be multiple bishops. But I bring this up that, all right, this is someone that has something to say that people actually in the church actually listen to. All right. I'm published in a Romanian Orthodox journal, which obviously has the blessing of the bishop of that local diocese where that journal is published. Revista Theologica, I'm published there twice. Actually, 3 times. I'm losing count. I'm published there 3 times. And again, that doesn't make me the world's best Orthodox scholar. It doesn't mean you should even agree with my arguments. That's not my point. I'm making a side, though, to say I'm this person, but the online cultists will say, don't listen to Craig because he's allegedly morally defective. He's allegedly a moron. He allegedly doesn't understand X, Y, and Z. And so instead of responding to content, they actually cancel my content, right? None of them will say, watch the Icon documentary, thank God, it's got 163,000 views and things like this, even though it has a great evangelistic purpose that could be used by both Roman Catholics and Orthodox. They prevent me from going on other shows to talk about important topics like Rise and Fall of the Papacy, because essentially they're attacking me personally, and I suppose that's fine, that's between them and God, but my point is, people have to be intelligent enough to see when someone's canceled. The counterculture has been this rejection of canceling culture, but just like the cults control people and persecute their own members, we have the same thing within these religious responses, including in Orthodoxy. So, but it's not to finger point just Orthodox. I'm going to share screen for the moment, and I'll make it bigger. Recently, I forget his name, the guy who does Roots of Orthodoxy, who's Roman Catholic, he now has a spin-off channel on East-West issues, which is definitely a good business model, called Roots of Faith, was asked by one of the commenters, his name is Jonathan, have you read the book from Craig Truglia? Will you have him on the show? His response, he's always welcome on the podcast. I have his book, but I've not read it. What are your thoughts? So a thoughtful, nice response. And I simply said, I'm game on this channel, as from what I can tell, it is dedicated to East-West issues specifically. All right. And I'm going to make a prediction in the future. I will never be on this channel. And I'll tell you why. Because one of his guests will email him and it will be with all sorts of lies and slander about me. And for some reason, people are not intelligent enough to go, okay, this sounds serious, but I'm going to do a little research and at least reach out to this guy to see if he has got anything that makes sense about this. Apparently, people don't do that. They just listen to the first person that slanders, they consider that research. And obviously, anyone who does that is awful at researching, and I would not trust their conclusions. Because if someone doesn't look at both sides on a question, how on earth do they become to a rational conclusion? They're literally in an echo chamber. But I won't be on the show because it's a successful, effeminate cancel tactic just to badmouth the individual. Now, maybe Jonathan's not like this, so this is not personal to him. But it's just I've seen it so often, I kind of don't see it going any other way. Right? I'm cynical, right? Nothing against you, Jonathan. I'm cynical about all these cultists doing this stuff, right? Like, I don't contact people about Eric Ybarra. I have other things in my life than Eric Ybarra and Mike Lofton and these guys that have purposely gone behind my back, William Albrecht, to do this stuff. I won't name the Orthodox people because I never badmouth other people in the church, even when they badmouth me. Only once was I blessed to talk about Father Aiden. And otherwise, I really stay clear of it because I don't think it's useful for building up the church. I believe in building the church. I'd rather be wronged than have what's right. I'd rather be wronged by someone else in the church. Actually, that's the teaching of 2 Corinthians 5. Yeah. No, that's 6. 2 Corinthians 6. 1 Corinthians 6. So be that as it may, I'd rather be wronged. So be it. And the onus is on the people consuming the content and doing their research to have half a brain and know someone who badmouths someone else, maybe that person is a moral degenerate, but I have to see if this, one, is true, and two, more importantly, has any relevance to the actual question I'm researching. There were all sorts of historians. We don't get into the personal morals to see whether the history books are right? It's kind of irrelevant. But that being said, they'll probably cancel me from going on a show like this, and this speaks to the cult-like behavior. And so even the counterculture, right, it may have good or even evil impetus behind it. This case, we see a kind of positive impetus, but that doesn't mean it's immune to evil. And so I call people to repent from the cult-like behavior. We're building up the body of Christ. We're building up the church, not our own brand, not our own bank accounts. We're building up the church. All right. And I will say that I would always want to go to Jonathan's East-West channel because I think it would be appropriate to be there. I think it's appropriate because it's about East-West issues. It doesn't appear to have a veneer of Orthodox evangelism. This is nothing personal to Jonathan, but I'm against all people because, again, I'm from the 90s. That make their living, if they're not a clergyman, being like a televangelist or something. I just don't like it. Doesn't mean I can't like you as an individual. Doesn't mean I won't even go on those channels, but I'm against it. I don't think, unless you're actually an artist, you produce movies, you produce literal like paintings on the wall. Unless you're a real artist, not just some talking head with opinion, I'm pretty much against it. And a priest is a talking head with opinion. So we have those guys. We don't need more talking heads with opinions. And so that's how I feel. It's something personal to Jonathan. So don't take it as an insult because someone will screen cap, Craig said this somewhere. That means, he's a meanie, never talk to him. It's not personal to him. It's how I feel about everyone. It's why I don't take money to do this, because it's how I feel. The second thing is, I'm more critical of the clergy that have appeared on Roots of Orthodoxy than Roots of Faith doesn't have the appearance of some sort of Orthodox evangelism or a source of Orthodox spirituality. I wouldn't want a Roman Catholic, no offense to Jonathan, to be the source of Roman Catholic spirituality. But I got no problem with a Roman Catholic, which is why I was on Reason Theology, being the source of the East-West debate, because it's a debate. It has two sides. But Orthodoxy should only have an Orthodox side. Again, that's how I feel. It's not an insult to Jonathan. Or the young man that does gospel simplicity, and the guys that 10-minute Bible hour, and the guys that kind of purposely ride the fence in order to present Orthodoxy because it, again, it's profitable to them. Maybe if they did it absolutely for free, I would feel a little less conflicted about it, personally speaking. But you know what? What happened to the days in the 90s where people could disagree about something foundational like this, but still get along and still have a conversation? I mean, that's what men could do. Women fight about the little stuff. And with this mass integration of technology where we could do aggressive things in cultist behavior without using our physicality with the technology, the men are becoming women, and it's effeminate behavior. Anyway, that's enough of that aside. The last thing on the Orthodox veneer is that it provides a cogent worldview, which we kind of already covered with the Orthodox commentary here. It's a cogent worldview that answers the nihilism and answers the atheism and answers why the other churches are wrong and they haven't been able to stand up to this dominant culture that's so evil today. Orthodoxy provides a cogent worldview. Now, that is not to say, because again, Orthodoxy is not solely the counterculture, it's an outgrowth of this counterculture. This reactionary counterculture that started 2008. There are other alternatives that are less extreme. Remember, people are really at least attracted by the most extreme, even if they never go all the way. My guess is that Jonathan, to take in good faith, that he's sincere and really finds Orthodoxy spirituality useful and helpful, because I know Roman Catholics like this. They'll even say, yeah, Orthodox Church is right about everything. I'm just Roman Catholic. Okay. That's actually kind of a more normie, maybe potentially dominant Roman Catholic view for those Roman Catholics that are actually aware of Orthodoxy. Not apologetics, but again, in the real world. But there are less extreme alternatives. They just can't leave their Italian church or their Polish church. They just can't become Eastern and, and see everyone wearing black and men and women. It's just too different from what they're used to. So there are these less extreme alternatives, which are still part of the counterculture. So obviously, trad Roman Catholicism. There is a smaller, weirder subset of those who fully embrace Pope Francis. And because neither are going to say he's paradigm destroying, but some will embrace Pope Francis, he's not paradigm destroying at all. They don't even ring alarm bell. And which I think is actually more theologically and ideologically consistent. But there's a reason why most are trad, because again, the counterculture is the impulse behind it. There's Anglo-Catholicism, which is this somewhat anachronistic internal reform movement within Anglicanism, because it started really in the 1800s. So it's not traditional Anglicanism, which was very friendly with continental Protestantism. But its moment in apologetics is this kind of reactionary Anglicanism, and which really began in the 1800s. It's not like it began now, but it's popular now in the online sphere because of this countercultural impulse. Calvinism, because it always has these confessions and stuff, whether it's Baptist, it's Presbyterian, etc. Even this, I forgot Lutheranism, but these more magisterial Protestant movements have an impulse because it's a return and hearkening for the past. And that is something that the counterculture feeds into. Now, what do they all have in common? They're all pretty weak in missionary work. No one wants to talk about this. They go, Orthodox suck at missions. They're terrible at missions, excuse me. But if you think about it, when's the last serious win in the modern era of Roman Catholics? That it wasn't an absolute gift, like East Timor. The Muslims took over East Timor and they made a law saying you have to choose a monotheistic religion. It has to be Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. Right? It's so there's an oppression. So you think they're all going to pick Islam because they're given a choice? Of course they're not going to pick Islam. They picked Roman Catholicism because that's the available Christianity there. So but what are the actual recent, without stacked decks, great Roman Catholic missionary works? I don't see it in Cambodia. I don't see it in Vietnam. It's not in Vietnam. It's not out there because even if it's bigger than Orthodoxy, none of the countercultural impulses feed into evangelism and missionary work because they're more concerned with correctness, rigor, and inter-Christian feuding. The more concerned with converting other Christians because this feeds into correctness. Now, this doesn't mean we shouldn't convert the sectarians because they've always done that, but they've always also converted non-believers. There was always this very large impulse to convert non-believers. So like in Russia, yes, they're trying to convert the Uniates, but they're also trying to convert all the pagans too. But there's this much stronger emphasis in the counterculture, because the counterculture is about stability in an uncertain world, certainty in an uncertain world, correctness in a world full of lies. So, right, that impulse is just about being correct. It's not about devotion. It's not about compassion. Now, these things could be joined to it, but that's not what's the impulse behind the counterculture. All right, so it leads to apostasy, and it certainly hurts missions, and it's what they all have in common. Someone's got to say the obvious. I'm saying the obvious. Let's make some predictions for the future. Again, I am not a prophet on this sort of stuff, but I don't know. Here are my predictions. Have fun with it. How's that? Orthodoxy will hit a ceiling. There's only so many people that will really want to go to the bottom of the rabbit hole. They'll settle for certain Christian religions like Lutheranism. It'll get more conservative. Roman Catholicism, it will get more conservative. Maybe not in the next 10 years, but it will get more conservative. The magisterial Protestant movement still get more conservative. So a lot of those people won't go full Orthodox. We have this here. Brother is nailing it. Thank you, Orthodox perspective. But Orthodoxy sadly will hit a ceiling because the cultural impulse can only get people so far, probably, right? It gets people interested, but it doesn't mean everyone's ideologically pure and they're going to make the right decision. All countercultures have always kind of settled and parts get shut off. And that's what that whole history lesson was showing. I even think it will become post-Christian. Like this neo-morals and the counterculture won't be just Christian. So like, for example, I was watching an interview with J.D. Vance, and he was on some degenerate show, and the degenerate he just wasn't as thoroughly nihilistic. He was like a typical Gen X schlock, right? Doesn't really believe in Christianity, but, the gender stuff's gone too far. The especially with the surgeries, that's gone too far. And, it's fun to have, it's good, it's okay to experiment with some drugs. We can't do too many drugs. And it's like, right, it's obviously not a Christian ethic. It's some sort of ethic. It is a conscious rejection, the full-blown nihilism. Like, this is what Joe Rogan, right? Like, Joe Rogan has some sort of ethics espoused in the show, but he's a drug addict, right? Jordan Peterson has some sort of ethics, but he's a drug addict. Now, like, oh no, Jordan Peterson never be on my show. I mean, but Jordan Peterson pops a ton of pills. He's, you could say they're legal pills, but I consider, to me, that's being a drug addict. They could be nicer people than me. That's not the point, right? The point is, it's a post-Christian ethic. It's not a Christian ethic. And the counterculture feeds just as much into Jordan Peterson ethic as it feeds into legitimate orthodoxy. And so I think we could even see the formulation of true post-Christian religions, but we're probably a generation or two away from that. Because I actually think the dominant culture we have today is here to stay. And that means the counterculture we have today is here to stay. The counterculture will, I'm confident, spread to the global south. It's already spread to Cambodia. So because the global south is being imposed with Western monoculture, they're going to get all the gender and sexuality stuff that we have, and it's going to lead to the exact identical response, which means this is our moment to do serious missionary work in the global south, because our window will close, because then there'll be post-Christian ideologies for them to espouse and adhere to. I'll repeat, this is the window for missionary work in the global south. That means everywhere outside the first world, pretty much, right? They call it global south these days. Before either full-blown secularism takes over or a post-Christian worldview could be offered as a replacement to these people. This is why tons of Cambodians are becoming Christian or Christian adjacent or interested. Okay? And our window will close if all of us, I don't care what you are, Protestant, whatever, if we don't, I'm not saying drop our disagreements. I mean, I got all sorts of disagreements. But we have to start dropping our money into this. Like, you got to start putting some money into this. You got to start putting your time into this. Take your 2-week vacation and go overseas and do something. All right, we'll get into a little bit of that. But this is a window that will close. We got to start doing it. Because it will spread to the global south. How far depends on you. Depends on you and people like us. It probably will not subvert the dominant culture, right? We talk of countercultures, always it subverts the dominant culture, but I don't think it probably will. It lacks females or enough of them where people could get married. And when they marry a woman that's just adjacent to this counterculture or just tolerant enough of it, it will lead to divorce. And generally, just sin is more attractive than virtue, which leads to apostasy. People find out Orthodoxy is not perfect in all the ways they imagine it was perfect. And then they get a girlfriend, like you already said, and so it kind of becomes easy to apostatize. Then there's the real question whether Elon Musk will subvert it. There's no doubt he bought Twitter and he's tapped into this counterculture and he's monetizing it. He's making money from it. And he's becoming powerful because of it. And if you just trust that somehow power corrupts everyone ever, but not Elon Musk, that's kind of crazy. Now, that doesn't mean God can't use Elon Musk to do good things, because God used the king of Assyria and Nebuchadnezzar to do things that were necessary to work out as well. With that being said, Elon Musk is consciously espousing the counterculture. He's consciously giving it access to people. And so why would he not consciously subvert it? So be mindful of this. Also be mindful that most of history lacked a counterculture becoming the dominant culture. Like most of medieval history, the dominant culture was this kind of repressive imperial Christian culture, right? In the Muslim world, consciously imperial Muslim culture. So to think that what we had in the last 100 years is going to be normal is the historical exception. I think it's the opposite. This is why I think our counterculture we have now is here to stay, though without birth rate, it will decrease. And it would have to increase through conversions. And without and the dominant culture we have today is here to stay. We already talked about the ramification of evangelism, but I'll make this one thing. Someone adds, so what do we do? Of course, I'm going to give you some of the normie stuff, but long term, we have to take control of the institutions, right? How did Christianity become the dominant culture? Because Constantine became Christian, because Saints Vladimir and Saint Olga became Christian, right? This is what actually successfully creates a dominant Christian culture, is that the people and machinations of power become Christian. And so we have to become college professors. We have to become journalists. We have to take over the levers of power. Or my joke is we all have to become essentially like 30% of us have to become electricians or work for a power company. So you could actually turn the power off if it ever gets too bad, because they can't operate without that 30%. So that's kind of like a syndicalist take. But the normie take is you have to take the dominant levers of power. We have to take over our churches. You have to go to seminary. You have to become a monk. Eventually, those are the people that become bishops. You have to get PhDs. You have to actually do these things. You can't just becoming an influencer. You're just converting the already converted and stirring the pot. You're just making money off the counterculture. You're not eventually taking over the dominant culture. Now, there's nothing wrong with the people that do this stuff successfully. God gives people all sorts of different roles in the church. The time in my life to get a PhD is way past, right? So that ain't going to be me. But I could pivot it into really becoming a missionary to the people, per se, right? Like a general missionary, actually go and work with people. But other people could become history teachers, journalists, politicians. These are the people that could make Christianity the dominant culture. That's what has to occur. All right, so we will continue. We have a potential game changer. I don't think it's likely. It'd be too good to be true, but I actually think I'd be dishonest if I were not to say, because there are prophecies that there could be a global takeover of Orthodoxy and a great mass conversion to Orthodoxy for the end of the world. Now, this is predictions of saints. I don't see how they may occur. I don't predict it. You just saw my predictions. But if it's going to happen, here's what has to happen. And what I'm posing here isn't actually crazy. It's, in fact, in some respects, likely on this level, which is we might see in the next 10 years a massive eternal reform within Orthodoxy that we probably have not seen since the 1600s, right, with the anti-Protestant councils, where pretty much the Orthodox Church got down. They got rid of the Patriarch of Moscow ultimately. They deposed him. They had these anti-Protestant councils. They created catechisms. It was like kind of this ecumenical, in the pre-1453 sense of the term, kind of moment for Orthodoxy in the 1600s. 1800s, only a little bit, not like the 1600s. But we might have our biggest moment since the 1600s, perhaps since even the 800s, in the next 10 years. And you can't be too surprised because the technology, information moves so fast. And I think God might be putting some things into place where it could occur. Here's the potential game changer. It literally happened yesterday. Zelensky has greatly insulted Donald Trump and Vance, and this is leading to, and has already been leading to, but now I think this will consummate a decisive pivot for the United States foreign policy to go behind Russia. And with that, the war in Ukraine's over this year. It ain't gonna last that long without U.S. money and weapons, that's for sure. And so, war Ukraine ends this year, we might see a massive game changer in Orthodoxy. Now, God uses these secular geopolitical machinations in the history of his people to bring major change in the church. The Babylonians destroyed Judahite syncretism. Judaism was kind of unrecognizable before Nebuchadnezzar. They had some reforming kings like Josiah and Saints Josiah and Hezekiah. But that being said, the Babylonians really put it to death. Once they pretty much killed the people, they took all the elites, they sent them to Babylon. This led to this eternal reform where they became this Jewish monoculture, right? This Judahite monoculture, where then Judaism shedded all the syncretism. There's documented and archaeological evidence of this, honestly. I would debate, all the lame liberals, theological types on this, because their views aren't tenable. So that being said, you could see, and even St. Jeremiah talks about how Nebuchadnezzar is an instrument of God to make change for this, and that's exactly what occurred. Now, another was how the Caliphate destroyed monophysitism in its global sense. Of course, the Oriental Orthodox churches still exist, but they're not a global movement. Before then, monophysitism was a big part of what was the Orthodox Catholic Church, because they had the Fifth Council over the question, they had the Sixth Council over the question. Heresies are being concocted in order to bring in monophysitism, the Severians, the Julianists and stuff like this. And so that being the case, when the Caliphate expanded and pretty much cut off the whole monophysite churches and their movements and adherents from the rest of the Christian church, the result was it kind of destroyed it. And we stopped having monophysite flavored heresies like monothelitism, which finally was destroyed by the Sixth Council. But this would have never occurred without the Caliphate. Heraclius probably would have created a worldwide union with the Nestorians, the monophysites, and everyone else, and eventually with Rome, because he would have had the power to pivot back to Rome and force them if it weren't for Islam. And so God prevented it from occurring, in my opinion. And so big changes do occur because of secular, even evil people, geopolitical movements. Now, this occurred also Florence, right? If there was a strong Byzantine Empire, they could have perhaps forced the Roman Catholic Union, but the Turks were never going to allow this, and most of the Orthodox Church was under the Turks at that point. And Russia was never going to allow this because they're fighting Poland and Lithuania, so they were going to allow it. So these geopolitical machinations stacked the deck against Florence. Yes, St. Mark of Ephesus had real ideals, but a lot of these bishops are wishy-washy. They're just going to go where they were politically forced to go, and the geopolitics forced them to go the right way. That's why, like even Nicaea too, the geopolitics forced all these former iconoclasts to become iconodules. The geopolitics does play a role. Now, as I said, Neo-Trump and Vance, I call him Neo-Trump because the real Trump really was not a game changer for the counterculture. He has so far been. We're very early in his presidency, so we don't know where this is going to go. But with Russia, I think the pivot looks pretty decisive, right? And that's why it's relevant to the conversation. Trump and Vance have clearly pivoted to Russia, and Vance is pro the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical one. And so what happens next? All right. There may be a future Pan-Orthodox Council, and this is not crazy speculation because Patriarchs Daniel of Bulgaria and Romania publicly stated that they agree to hold a Pan-Orthodox Council over Ukraine when the war is over. So you have two of maybe the top 4 patriarchs on earth. So that's half, right? That's half. If you go by population, the strength of the churches, saying, yeah, we're going to have a council about this. And we're going to decide who the Church of Ukraine is. And you know when the second last Pan-Orthodox Council was, that was of serious note, was in Sofia in 1998, which is in Bulgaria. So it's not like, oh, this is something that can't happen. It happened a few decades ago. It's going to happen again. It is going to happen. The question is how far this goes. And Bulgaria is firmly pro-Ukrainian Orthodox Church and canonical traditionalism. And I can't imagine Romania, especially what's happening with their political election, unless there's a massive persecution, which could occur, because we talked about this. There could be a persecution against the church, so please pray about this stuff. Could lead to a Pan-Orthodox Council that's going to vindicate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which is the UOC, and as a result, is going to have to decide the question of how autocephaly, or autocephaly, I have to pronounce it, is determined. All right, this show's not about that. I think we already have a consensus historically how it's determined, but we're going to have a council that's going to just spell it out. And then how are the attendees of this council and who's going to attend going to decide? Russia obviously is going to go pro-UOC. The question is how far they go, meaning UOC already consider themselves autocephalous. Russia might have to give up on UOC and just accept their autocephalous. And if I had to guess, I think that's what's actually going to happen. Though, if Russia wins this war and then you get some Russian puppet put in there, you could see the UOC kind of going back on it and then just making peace the MP. That's possible too. But the point is, will Russia decide in favor of this kind of Bulgarian view of the UOC and potentially canonical traditionalism? Answer is yes. Is Serbia going to do it? Obviously, yes. Albania's previous primate said yes. I don't know where they're going now, and so that's why I don't have them here. Poland, yes, they're pro-Russian. Antioch, yes, due to Assad's fall. And this shows the geopolitics. Israel and Turkey, so the Muslims and the Jews, with the behest of America, pretty much take apart the dictator that kept the church safe in Syria. What do you think Antioch's going to decide at this council? They're going to go pro-West? Absolutely, positively not. And so the geopolitics have made it where they're going to go ahead with the UOC. They've already been more pro-UOC anyway. I think that's pretty much made it a 90% chance, which if we're playing odds, this is where the wind is blowing. Jerusalem, because the war with Israel, between the Palestinians and the Palestinians and the Israelis, they're going to go pro-UOC, not pro-West, because the West was what was keeping Israel up. And so, again, this does not look good for the OCU and the EP. Again, it's not like I'm not even being conspiratorial about this. I think this is actually fairly obvious. This is where the wind is blowing. Georgia, particularly the disputed election and their feminist prime minister, or is it president, I forget, refusing to step down, and now they got this conservative reactionary in there. They're going to go pro-Russia on this question. And they're going to, and the Georgian church already, their sensibility is pro this, not on the South Ossetia, obviously, and maybe they'll try to get South Ossetia as some sort of concession to them. But the point is, on the UOC question, autocephaly question, they're going to go pro-UOC. And this leads to this realignment, because maybe inertia leads to canonical reform, right? A clear canon on autocephaly, a clear canons maybe now on other questions, right? Maybe the calendar question, my dream, but more likely at least on the female deacon question. That seems like they're gonna nip that in the bud, and maybe they'll start deciding Africa and the United States. Though Africa probably, if they could buy off Alexandria, will be given back to Alexandria. And America, they might look the other way, which then means we have this festering wound still. But even then, maybe they might put a timeline. America must organize a national church, or North America must organize a national church within 50 years, right? So they'll push it off a long time so they could get money, but they'll canonically solve the theological question of ecclesiology. That could occur because they need to, because at the end of the day, America means nothing compared to Ukraine. Ukraine's got millions of more believers there. All right? Ukraine's in the backyard of the hundreds of millions of Eastern Orthodox. America isn't, right? So at the end of the day, America means nothing, right? Like, it means something to the EP because the EP's got only a few thousand people in Turkey, right? It means something to everyone else. They get some money, but not nearly as important as the Ukrainian question is. And so this might lead to profound ecclesiastical reform. At the very least, the UOCs decided in their favor. But I bring this up because if all of a sudden Orthodoxy fixes their glaring problems because of these geopolitical machinations, now it becomes this clearer alternative for the counterculture. And that's where I speculate maybe this is where the prophecies come into line. Maybe. So is this council going to happen? Very good chance without a massive persecution in Romania. How far it goes, we'll have to see what God has in store. Now, that being said, Cyprus is already split, so without overt U.S. meddling, which under Trump is not going to put the finger on the scale in favor of Ukraine, they're probably going to swing UOC. Alexandria appeared to be pro-OCU under pressure, but they could swing back because at the end of the day, they want those churches in Africa, and at the end of the day, those churches in Africa are a resource sink for Russia. My opinion, the Exarchate is a kind of bargaining chip, but they're serious missionaries that are trying to actually do serious work in Africa, and they obviously don't feel that way. But it could definitely be used as a bargaining chip. So anyway, where does this leave the Greeks in the EP? Because the Greeks are very much ecclesiastically tied to the EP. I think potentially a schism in the Greek church where some will go the right way, some won't. The Greek government is more in line with the EU, so what America wants won't sway them that much. Cyprus is a different story because Turkey's in the EU. And Turkey has half of Cyprus. EP maybe will go uniate because without, again, deposing their primates, how do they get fixed? So it's not impossible that their own synod then turns against these primates, deposes them, does some normie answer in dumping the OCU, accepting the regular Ukrainian Orthodox Church. OCU becomes illegal and gets persecuted pretty much. And then they all just kind of muddle along, and the autocephaly question maybe gets a half answer. That's very possible, but even if that occurs, it's not without some sort of seismic shift within the EP and Greeks. And that seismic shift internally then is like a dike that starts to leak. What else starts going when the counterculture gets that invigoration? You're going to see more reactionary fervor in those jurisdictions, in my opinion. And so it opens the possibility of a unified Orthodoxy that will be more appealing. So who knows with that future Pan-Orthodox Council. So I'm going to give a Cambodian mission update before I do audience questions. So that being said, this is really important. I came back on Monday, and I want donors and people considered to be donors to have a serious understanding of what's going on in Cambodia, where we're going. As pictured are the prayer books that some of them that were sent, and that really went down very well. And I just want to remind people, become a missionary or support missionary work. Websites, Patreon, and the website for the PayPal is below. And quite frankly, volunteers go on vacation Cambodia. We'll give you a free hotel, and you could do missionary work a couple hours a day, an hour a day, and you make a big difference. Here's my wife and I teaching the English class. I think that's the security camera because I don't remember them taking that picture, but it's really not that hard to start doing some missionary work there. Now, what did I do and my wife? So that's how I say, what did we do? And it includes my kid, right? It's whole family does this. We met with clergy and discussed needs. We'll get into some of those. We resumed the English class, which thanks to Paul, one of our catechumens there, may be resumed on a semi-permanent basis. It might be a couple times a month, not every weekday, but he might do it a couple times a month, which is huge because it could bring in, we have the van that brings in people from the province, so their kids might start coming again, and we could be bringing them to church, bringing the neighborhood kids to church. It's terribly cheap to do. It's like literally $3 a cookies, and you hold the class. It's very easy. And so if you want to make a difference, honestly, give $10 a month, and you paid for the English classes because it's just for the price of the cookies for the kids and like the brooms for them to clean up afterwards and stuff. So consider joining the Patreon. $10 a month, you paid for the English class. Not asking for a lot. $10 a month pays for the English class. So consider that. There is a person there named Christopher who may join that English class. You already did one of them. And so we could use more permanent missionaries. We'll get into that. But this is a positive change, which is why I actually have to physically go to Cambodia. You can't do all this stuff in Telegram. You actually have to meet, have in-person meetings, do stuff, get your hands dirty a little bit, do it yourself, bring Paul in, bring Christopher in, and actually get something rolling. Get the kids to expect it. Organize a program that's repeatable and a lesson plan that could be easily done. So that being said, that's something that we did there. We met with inquirers, had a couple meals, some drinks. I'm kind of grateful. Like the inquirers are their own clique. They're friends with each other. It's not like it's all built around me. I don't want it to be. So it was nice to meet them and to support the church and to support them. We did do a showing of the hidden history of early Christian art. It was probably, remember, even if they have good English, it's good colloquial English, not necessarily like intellectual English. It was probably over everyone but maybe 2 or 3 people's heads, maybe 4 people's heads. But we did a mass showing, and I'm considering doing a contest where I will award prizes to people that have the largest missionary showing of the film, right? Do a showing for Protestants, win a few books. We'll do cool stuff like that. So that's something I did there. We began work on opening a new chapel downtown. Again, why I have to go personally? There was a property that was available. There's someone who had icons available, like hand-painted icons. I put 2 and 2 together. Now we got a chapel opening. Plus, the chapel gives housing to our reader who's supported by the church. His housing's been supported by the church. So it covers all these things. It needs prayer. It will need probably some support, but I don't think right now. But I'll keep you updated with that. So again, what we did is we actually opened a chapel downtown on the other side of the city. So that way we could bring in not just somewhere to pray, but that we could do classes for inquirers, like a Wednesday night class, maybe a Lenten cooking class. We'll talk about what the women need to do, but a place where this stuff could be done that's appropriate and closer to a lot of people, because Phnom Penh is a major metropolis. It takes a long time to get places relatively. So anyway, that new chapel, please pray for the chapel. Again, as I referred to, we received an award. That's what that picture is. I got that smirk on my face because I don't even wear a wedding ring. That's the right hand. I have one. But it's just I'm not a jewelry person. And so this gorgeous, it's a kind of jewelry. I didn't expect it. They said, you're going to get an award from the Metropolitan. I thought that was very nice, but I thought it would be a plaque. I didn't think I'd be like a real Russian. The Russians actually get these medals. They start becoming like Soviet soldiers, and they get chests full of medals. And so, but that being said, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone who's contributed to the mission and continues to contribute to the mission. I'm just a means. I'm just a fellow worker. And so I mentioned the award because I want people to have a validation that what we're doing is being noticed. All right? I want you to know that what we're doing is being noticed. It's not invisible. The Metropolitan knows what we're doing. He supports what we're doing. And honestly, we'll get into this, 100% of the donations go to it. There's nothing skimmed. Honestly, money's lost in sending your money there. But that being said, it's making a difference there. It's being noticed. So what kind of future needs do we need? And I'll go like small to large. All right. Prayer is a must. Nothing happens without prayer. And so please pray for the mission. Pray for God to raise missionaries part-time, whatever they may be. We'll definitely do the prayer book thing again because we're almost out of them, and we're almost donated like $1,000 for prayer books. And luggage is the way to go because we actually bought more. We brought other things other than prayer books like Orthodox study Bibles. We have many Orthodox study Bibles in addition that are tied up because the Ministry of Cult and Religion holds onto material until they could check through things. I won't get to details or badmouth the Ministry of Cult and Religion, but the point is our ministry cut through a lot of red tape and got things into people's hands. And so that's why we're going to do it again. We're going to hopefully start Kamai YouTube channels, but I know some Kamai people follow me here. Start a Kamai YouTube channel and literally just read in Kamai, translate as you go, or read in English and just kind of give a synopsis, I recommend, of St. Philaret's Longer Catechism. There's a real demand for this. A lot of Kamai already know English that are attending church, but there are some, and many that are being shut out because it's not in their language. We need more online presence in Kamai. My wife got she didn't translate it, but she was able to do all the webmastering for OrthodoxChristianCambodia.com. Again, OrthodoxChristianCambodia.com for a Kamai language website. And we're beginning, as we'll get into, where there'll be Kamai-only resources on that website, like the Lives of the Saints taken from the Prologue of Oak Reed. So that's some future needs. Specific prayers, all right, for Stephanie, my wife, John, Christopher, Athanasius, Paisos. John does the translations. He's a reader. He pretty much does like a lot of the on like the Telegram channel and stuff. Christopher has been helpful with the icons, with the chapel. He's like a groundskeeper in the church. He's been very helpful, very kind young man. Great to be friends with him and pray for him. He's considering discerning monasticism, and just pray that God will bless him in every way. Athanasius is the iconographer, and so pray for him because he's young yet. And that being said, that he'll have humility and great grace and ability in doing what he does. His ambition is just to do art as a side job. Like he just wants a real job. So pray for him to have discernment. He's the sort of person that, I feel, right, maybe could learn art in another country, bring that degree back with him. He could still get good work in Cambodia because there's a degree outside of Cambodia, and then he could teach iconographers in Cambodia. But this is only possible through your prayers. So we need your prayers. There is, that's Paisos. Sorry, I'm confusing. Athanasius is another person who's very instrumental in helping with the inquirers and everything. So Paisos iconographer. I've been doing this for almost 3 hours, so forgive me. John is beginning a translation of the Prologue of Oak Reed. It's about $10 a day. That's the reality. You want something done? It's going to cost money. It's going to take time. All right? Because this takes time out of his day that he needs, and time away from him to do other work. So this translation costs $10 a day. It's made by an Orthodox person that's a translator. And you could go to patreon.com/Orthodox Christian Theology or give a one-time donation. So you're responsible. You'll be the reason why there is a Life of the Saint for that day in Kamai for $10. And so $10 a day makes all the difference in the world. $100 does 10 days. $3,000 does almost the whole year. So you just have to keep that in mind. This is something that, because it's a kind of low dollar amount, is doable. And because it's doable, we are doing it. We are covering it. But if someone decides to adopt this as their own cause, this allows us to then use money for other things to grow the church. Please pray for the chapel's use. I think ultimately we might do things like, so we could do stuff with inquirers, like cooking class during Lent, air conditioning for, let's say, because there's guest rooms, like air conditioning for the guest room and certain stuff like that, which is needed both to fight mosquitoes and not to be killed in the heat, pretty much. So these are things that might go, but for now it's running. I'll keep you guys updated about that. So for now, please just pray for the chapel and its use. I'm going to ask for continued monthly support so it could be budgeted at orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. I want you to know that PayPal has 100% of the donations sent to Cambodia, that minus the PayPal fee, which is relatively low, and you could consciously pick to pay the fee on PayPal. So 100% so far, no tax ramifications, because it's not a 501c3. We will now do Patreon because it's just easier for people to be on Patreon and to donate that way. I've resisted it for years because I don't believe in a cult of personality. I'm not going to be giving away secret knowledge on Patreon. I don't have the time to. If I put anything on Patreon that's Patreon only, it'll be silly stuff. Maybe you like me enough or you want my silly stuff, but it's not going to be important stuff that's needed for missionary work. I will not have Gnostic secret knowledge. What is good for the mission will be for the world, and that's what we'll do. So we just had someone who just joined. The chat. No, join Patreon. Join the Patreon. So again, they take commission quite a bit higher than PayPal. They have no 501c3, so they take taxes out at the end of the year because it's like a revenue. At the end of the day, I ain't going to pay those taxes. So your donation will pay those taxes. So if it's easier for you, by all means, use Patreon, because it's better that 70% of the money make it there and 0% make it to me and 30% make it to Uncle Sam and Patreon. Then 0% go to translating something in Cambodia. All right. So for $5, you can be a friend of the show. And there's other tiers so that you could help support real missionary work that makes a difference. And that's why I put the medal there. It's not the boast. It's to validate that this is a real mission that is recognized by the jurisdiction, that is making a real difference. And I want you to be part of that, because this medal belongs to everyone who makes a difference in this church. There's also for people who want to do serious donations, direct bank transfers. We have this. Do you all have Cash App or Venmo I could drop something into? And honestly, no, because I'm not a drug dealer. I'll have to figure out how to do Cash App or Venmo. Please subscribe to this channel and check out the community page. That sounds like something innocuous enough where, again, you'll have to pay the taxes. Maybe it'll be tax-wise as gift. I don't know, Venmo. But the point is, as much the donation I could send without losing my shirt in it will be sent to Cambodia. So we'll work on a Cash App and a Venmo, and we will put a sticky on this show and do a community post page for those who want to support that way. All right. We have more future needs. We need more missionaries. And this is the great part. We could be very flexible. We could take literally vacationers, go there, have fun, go to Thailand, whatever you want to do, but do a little bit to support the mission. It makes all the difference in the world, because sometimes you just need to get the creative juices flowing. All right. So short-term mission, if you go, you can literally make it your vacation. We will house you. It's like, listen, this is not about the money. It's about building the church. I'll give you somewhere to stay with air conditioning in the city of Phnom Penh. All right. And so by all means, consider being a short-term missionary. By all means, consider being a tent maker, going to Cambodia, getting a job for 6 months or something like that, right? You're paying your own bills. We'll provide housing and make a serious dent and a serious support in the mission work. We're also, with donations, going to take on paid missionary work for those who need the pay that will do it full-time as a job. But all I can tell you is I used to own a business, so if this is your job, you're going to have work to do, but you will get paid a modest salary that will be very comfortable in the country and housed. Please contact me if you're interested in being a paid missionary. But again, we're going to expect serious work and serious credentials for those. This also speaks to another priest or clergyman. They need another priest or clergyman. The reality is people aren't volunteering to go to Cambodia. You will be housed. You'll have a salary. It's not a free job. Nothing stops you from getting other work, by the way. Priests have other jobs. So it's like you could go make more money. If you're already a priest that works remotely, or you're going to seminary, you're going to be a priest or a reader, and you need ordination or something, and you will continue doing work remotely, here's a way where you could be rich, or you could take all your money and give to the church. I don't care. The point is you can live very comfortably, and we could support you because we need another clergyman in the church, all right? A deacon or a priest, particularly, and we would provide a modest salary and housing. I only say this because a lot of people watch the show go to seminary, but they're not part of the Moscow patriarchy. And not everyone who's in Russia wants to go to Cambodia, nor listens to this show in English. But a lot of people that go to American seminaries do follow me and listen to this show. And I want to let you know that we will get you hired if you're serious about becoming a priest in Cambodia. And in some respects, because it doesn't have a very built-in, let's say a bunch of Greeks that want you to do the Greek festival or something like that. In some respects, it's a very easy priest job. So it's a good thing to consider, and you will be paid. It's not fake. This is a real ministry. So we need another priest. Pray about it. If you're going to seminary, consider it. Okay. You of course need blessings. I'm just a guy who facilitates it. I'm just a missionary. I am not your bishop. And I'm not your spiritual father. So you will have to go through all legitimate avenues, and we'll work on that together, and we'll facilitate everyone having this conversation. We have a wish list, and I need to tell you what this wish list is. First is a church bell. I'll have a video on that soon after we figure out the costs involved and the brand of bell, because it's got to deal with heat. It's got to be sent to Cambodia and stuff like that. So a church bell. The church in Thailand, not Cambodia, though it affects Cambodia because they'd be printing our material, wants to make a printing press. It's probably about $50,000. We're working on an exact proposal so that way people actually know exactly what it needs. That being said, a printing press serves two functions. That way we could print materials in these countries, and with support for the local governing authorities, we could just print things on demand and then not require all these other hoops, right? So it helps with evangelism because we can make our own material. The second thing is it could actually become a means of revenue, which supports the missionary work in the church because it needs money. So it's a twofer. It's an awesome twofer. And it's a relatively modest donation as far as missionary needs go, but obviously a lot for a viewer. And so we put it out there. We'll have exact dollars and cents for those who are supported in the printing press. But that's, again, a bigger wish. That's why I went small to large. The school is the biggest one. That's the biggest difference maker. We sadly have had a large donor fall through. School needs about $3 to 4 million. It will, property market right now is pretty stable. So it probably will stay there for a little bit. But literally all of the bureaucratic hoops have been hammered out and solved. What is needed now is money. And schools have been the most successful means of evangelism other than converting royalty. And so we need an Orthodox school there. The question's a matter of when we're going to do it, but it needs serious money. So it will seriously create converts to Christianity, and it requires serious money. School has other ramifications. For those who are interested, it would hire another clergyman. This is all built in the budget and the way the school's organized. There's been a lot of hard work in organizing this. Working with, for example, I'll call him a superintendent of a large English language school in Cambodia. It's in the tens of millions of dollars. So we're dealing with serious people here. This would be for the Orthodox version, which would be a very junior partner and totally separate from them. But we're working with people that actually build schools, all right, through my own personal relationships. And so what we need now is capital. And I do think God will ultimately provide capital. I don't know when. It's all in God's timing. But if you want Cambodia to become the next Korea of Asia, it's going to need schools. Not just school, but schools. So how do you get schools? You start with a school. So you could show people the difference it's making. We could turn Cambodia into a plurality Christian country, and we could turn it to an Orthodox country, but it requires serious missionary work. And you don't need to be the one who solves everything. $5 a month, $100 a month. If you have the massive resources, tens of thousands of dollars, even millions, you could make the difference. I'm letting you know so you know we've done plans and can actually make these things happen. And so now it's time to raise the money. All right. And so I will end this show by reminding people before we get the audience questions, please go to orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate to learn more about the mission, to financially support the mission. If you want to do so regularly in a way that's easier, patreon.com/Orthodox Christian Theology. Links are below. And as I said, we will work on Venmo and Cash App, I suppose, in order to get that working for you. And so we'll do some start questions, and then we'll call it a day. Bro, just made me sober. This has been bothering me a while. Thinking of making the sign of the cross for my colleagues at school. We're teachers. We have Craig's greetings. I have a close friend of my spiritual father who's a hero monk. He kept talking about that. I thought he was going to make a point. I'm sorry. Oh, hopefully he supports the church in Cambodia somehow. I heard that the Russians are pushing for an African autocephaly, but I saw this on Facebook, and it's likely bonkers because of the number of members and the financial support. Yeah, African church couldn't support themselves financially with autocephaly. So it's, but again, this could be some sort of political machination, which exists in the church. It's just reality. I tuned in late. I heard some discussion of socialism. You have to be kind and rewind. And then we have, do you think there'll be another look at an Oriental Orthodox reunion? I think when we get our stuff in order first. Same with the True Orthodox. I think we got to get our own house in order ultimately. Now, pretty much, I hope that you learning that the countercultural impulse and what leads to it and why we have the horrible dominant culture we have today, how that's fed into converts to Orthodoxy. I hope it gives us some reason for pause and warning, because apostasy could happen if we oversell what the Orthodox Church is. Apostasy could happen if we don't understand the magisterium of the church, that the church is preserved from error and how it is through consensus-based ecclesiology and epistemology. That we understand ourselves, that we understand these kind of emotional impulses that are leading to these decisions. So we need to be honest with ourselves. And lastly, that you see what's going on in Cambodia, a serious mission that needs your support, and how you, in small and big ways, could support it. So it's been a real pleasure to provide you with this presentation. And so I will end the show as I end all of them. Like, subscribe, and remember, fight to the death for the truth. The Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.